There is a kind of cold that doesn't just freeze water, it freezes time. A cold so aggressive it snaps ancient trees like twigs and turns the air inside your own home into a weapon. Tonight we drift back to a time when winter winds were not simply weather, but living presences that shaped every hour of existence. We journey to the frozen frontiers where settlers built their lives log by log, only to watch those same logs tremble and moan under the relentless push of invisible hands. As you curl up under your own covers, safe and warm, take a quiet moment to subscribe to Epic Boring History. Leave a comment letting me know what time it is in your part of the world as we begin. Now let the lights grow dim, maybe turn on a soft fan for that gentle background whisper. Let's settle in together for tonight's slow walk through history's coldest memories. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of vast, open plains where the land stretches endlessly in every direction, broken only by scattered stands of birch and pine. The Siberian frontier in winter is a place where wind does not merely blow, it rules, sweeping across the empty miles with nothing to slow its journey, gathering speed and fury as it moves. You have built a cabin here, log by log, with your own hands and the help of neighbors who know that survival depends on such mutual labor. The cabin sits low against the earth, a single room with a sloped roof, walls of hewn timber, chinked with moss and clay, and a door that fits poorly in its frame. This is your home, and it is all that stands between you and the winter wind. The wind here is not like wind in gentler places. It does not gust and fade, does not come and go with passing storms. It arrives in autumn and remains through the darkest months, a constant companion that howls through the endless nights. Some nights it moans low and steady, a sound like distant voices speaking in a language you cannot understand. Other nights it rises to a shriek that makes the cabin walls shake and the roof beams groan. The snow it carries moves horizontally across the land, sweeping past your windows like sand across a desert, piling into drifts that reshape the landscape each morning. You wake before dawn because the cold has seeped through your blankets, drawn in by drafts that snake across the floor like invisible rivers. The darkness inside the cabin is absolute, broken only by the faint glow of banked embers in the hearth. Already you can hear the wind outside, a steady rushing punctuated by sudden gusts that slam against the walls. The sound is everywhere at once, in the rafters above, in the gaps between logs, in the space beneath the door where a thin line of snow has appeared during the night. You rise from your sleeping platform, your breath visible in the dim light, and your feet find the cold floor. The first sensation is always the same, a shock of icy wood against bare skin, followed by the prickling awareness of drafts moving across your ankles. Every morning begins this way, with the realization that the wind has been working all night to undo your efforts. You dress quickly in layers of wool and fur, pulling on boots lined with straw and leather bindings that take time to wrap properly. Your first task is to inspect the cabin for new damage, walking the perimeter in the pre-dawn darkness with a lantern held low. The wind pushes against you as you step outside, stealing the warmth from your face instantly. You examine each wall, running your hands along the logs to feel for places where the moss has been blown loose or where ice has formed in the chinking. Gaps appear overnight, the wood contracts in the cold, the moss dries and crumbles, the clay cracks under the freeze and thaw of temperature changes. Each gap is a wound in your home's defense, a place where wind will enter and warmth will escape. You mark these places in your memory, adding them to the mental list of repairs that never seems to grow shorter. Next, you check the snow accumulation against the cabin's base, noting where drifts have formed and where the wind has scoured the ground bare. You take your shovel and begin pushing snow against the exterior walls, packing it tightly to create an insulating barrier. This is work that must be done carefully. Too much snow and it weighs against the structure, too little and the wind finds its way through. The snow you pack today will be blown away or melted by tomorrow, requiring you to do this same task again and again. Your breath comes in clouds that the wind tears away before they can dissipate naturally. Your hands, even in thick mittens, begin to ache within minutes as you work. The wind finds every exposed piece of skin, turning your cheeks and nose raw. When you finally return inside, the cabin feels warmer by comparison. Though the temperature has not truly changed, you have simply grown colder. Inside, you tend to the fire, adding wood carefully to coax flame from ember. The chimney draws poorly in strong winds, and smoke sometimes billows back into the room, filling the space with stinging haze. You adjust the damper, trying to find the balance that allows smoke to escape without letting wind blow down the flue. This is a constant negotiation, different each day depending on wind direction and strength. The fire is your lifeline, and yet it consumes wood at an alarming rate. Each log must be cut, carried, split, and stacked, labor that occupies much of your daylight hours. The wind makes this work harder, blowing sawdust into your eyes as you saw, pushing against you as you carry armloads of split wood. On the worst days, when the wind howls without pause, a single day's warmth might consume 3 days' worth of cutting. As morning light filters through the small window, a frame covered with scraped hide that glows amber when the sun finds it, you prepare a simple meal. Water must be melted from snow, a process that takes time and fuel. Porridge cooks slowly over the fire, thickening as you stir. You eat, standing near the hearth because the far corners of the room remain painfully cold. Your family gathers close, children wrapped in blankets, everyone positioning themselves to capture what little warmth radiates from the stones. The wind continues its endless song, a backdrop to every conversation, every thought. Throughout the day, you work on repairs. You take handfuls of dried moss and stuff them into gaps between logs, packing them tightly with a wooden tool shaped for this purpose. The moss is gathered in autumn when it still holds moisture and pliability. By winter, it has dried to a brittle state that crumbles easily. You wet it slightly with melted snow to make it more workable, pressing it deep into the cracks. Over this, you smear a mixture of clay and straw, smoothing it with your fingers until the gap disappears. The clay freezes almost immediately in this cold, becoming hard and brittle. By tomorrow, some of these same repairs will have failed, cracked open by the constant movement of the cabin's timbers as they expand and contract. This is the rhythm of your days: repair, fail, repair again. You hang animal hides over the weakest sections of wall, creating a second barrier against the wind. The hides ripple and flutter when strong gusts hit, but they trap a thin layer of still air that provides some insulation. Blankets, too, are hung from pegs, creating makeshift inner walls that divide the single room into smaller spaces. These fabric walls move constantly, breathing in and out with the pressure changes the wind creates. The children watch you work, learning by observation. They will need these skills. Every person who survives winter here must become an expert in reading wind, in understanding how structures fail, in knowing which repairs to prioritize. The door is a constant source of frustration. It was built as well as you could manage, but wood is never perfectly straight, and the frame settles unevenly as the ground beneath freezes and shifts. Gaps appear along the edges, and the latch struggles to hold against the pressure when wind strikes the door directly. You wedge rags into the spaces, but these work their way loose. You pile heavy objects against the base of the door to keep it sealed. Still, on the worst nights, The door rattles in its frame, and you lie awake, wondering if it will hold. The roof is perhaps your greatest concern. It was constructed with care, rafters notched and joined, a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, then sod and turf packed thick above. But wind pushes at the roof from below and above simultaneously, creating stresses that timber alone cannot always withstand. Snow accumulates in drifts on the leeward side, adding weight that makes the beams creak and sag. You climb up regularly to clear the heaviest accumulations, working with a long pole to push snow off before it becomes too heavy. This is dangerous work performed on a slippery surface, while wind tries to knock you off balance. Each time you climb down safely, you feel a mixture of relief and dread, knowing you will have to do it again soon. The wind never stops, and so your work never stops. Inside the cabin, the sensory experience of wind becomes a form of intimate knowledge. You learn to distinguish between different types of drafts by how they feel against your skin. There is the sharp, direct stream that comes through a gap in the wall. This feels like a needle of cold air that finds you no matter where you sit. There is the rolling draft that moves along the floor, invisible but unmistakable as it passes over your feet. There is the descending draft from the roof area, cold air that sinks down from above when the fire is low. Each of these requires a different response, a different repair strategy. The sounds of wind become a vocabulary you learn to read. The low moan through a particular gap means wind from the north. The high whistle through the roof boards means wind from the west. The rattling of the door in its frame means a strong, sustained wind rather than gusting. The creaking of the roof beams tells you about snow load and structural stress. You learn to sleep through some sounds but wake instantly at others. A sudden crack, an unfamiliar groan, a change in the wind's pitch that suggests something has failed. At night, you bank the fire carefully, building it up with large logs that will burn slowly through the dark hours. You pull all the blankets and furs toward the sleeping platform, creating a nest of warmth in the cold room. Your family huddles together, body heat shared, children tucked between adults. Even so, the cold finds you, your face exposed to the air, grows numb, your breath freezes on the blankets, and you wake periodically to check the fire. The wind sounds different at night, more menacing somehow, as if darkness gives it additional power. The cabin groans and shifts, timbers talking to each other in wooden voices. Sometimes you hear something fall outside, a tool blown from its place, a section of fence collapsing, a stack of firewood scattering. These sounds mean additional work tomorrow, more repairs to add to the endless list. You lie in the dark and listen, trying to determine by sound alone what has failed. Experience teaches you to recognize different types of damage by the noise they make. The soft thump of moss falling from a wall, the sharp crack of a frozen branch breaking, the sustained rattle that means a shutter has come loose. Morning comes slowly, the darkness grudging in its retreat. You rise again, stiff from cold and from the tension of sleeping lightly, and begin the cycle once more. Outside you survey what the night has brought. Perhaps a section of the chimney cap has shifted, allowing snow to fall into the flue. Perhaps the woodpile has toppled, logs scattered across the ground. Perhaps new cracks have appeared in the walls, where ice has wedged between the logs overnight. You gather the tools you will need: wooden wedges, strips of hide, lengths of rope, your small hammer, a knife for trimming and shaping. The work is familiar but never identical, each day presenting its own unique constellation of failures and necessary responses. Your neighbors emerge from their own cabins, and you exchange words across the distance, shouting to be heard over the wind. Someone needs help re-securing a roof section. Someone else has lost their door latch and is holding the door closed with rope. These are the small tragedies of winter life, and everyone understands that help given is help that will be returned when your own crisis comes. Community here is not about friendship or social pleasure. It is about survival. You work together because alone you would die, and the wind makes this truth undeniable. The physical toll of fighting wind accumulates slowly. Your hands become rough and calloused, split along the fingertips where cold and dry air crack the skin. Your shoulders ache from hauling materials and pushing against the wind as you work outside. Your back grows sore from bending to pack snow and moss and clay. Sleep deprivation builds gradually. You never get truly deep rest when the cabin is shaking and creaking around you. Your eyes sting from smoke and from wind-blown grit when you work outside. Your lungs hurt from breathing intensely cold air. The wind does not strike you once and move on. It erodes you slowly, wearing away at your strength and resilience day after day. The children are perhaps the most affected, though they show it differently. They grow quiet during the loudest storms, huddling close and speaking in whispers. They develop fears of specific sounds. One child might startle at the roof creaking, another at the moaning of wind through a particular gap. They watch the adults for signs of worry, learning to read anxiety in a glance or a quickened pace. They ask questions that are hard to answer. Will the roof hold? Will the wind ever stop? You give them tasks to distract them, fetching small items, helping to pack moss, holding tools while you work. This helps them feel useful and keeps their minds occupied, but the underlying anxiety remains. The psychological weight of constant wind is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. It is not simply noise. You could learn to ignore noise. It is the relentlessness, the fact that wind is always present, always testing, always pushing. You cannot relax completely because vigilance is required. You cannot rest deeply because something might fail while you sleep. The wind becomes an adversary that you can never quite defeat, only temporarily hold at bay. There is a peculiar sensation that develops over long winters, a feeling that the outside world is actively trying to enter, that the wind is not random but purposeful. The walls are all that separate inside from outside, order from chaos, life from death. When the wind is strongest, those walls feel desperately thin. You find yourself checking them compulsively, touching them, reassuring yourself of their solidity. You develop small rituals and superstitions, patterns of behavior that feel like they might help even though you know they are meaningless. You pack certain gaps in a particular order. You say the same words each morning as you inspect the walls. You arrange your tools in precise configurations, as if order inside might somehow influence the chaos outside. These rituals provide comfort and a sense of control, even when you understand intellectually that you have very little control over what happens. The wind will do what it does, and you can only respond. The worst moments come during the strongest storms, when wind reaches speeds that make the entire cabin shudder. The walls flex inward, the roof lifts and settles, the door bows against its frame. In these moments, you gather your family in the center of the room, away from the walls and beneath the strongest section of roof. You hold tools ready, an axe to cut your way out if the roof collapses, blankets to wrap around bodies if you must flee into the storm. You make plans you hope never to execute. Where you would run, how you would signal neighbors, what you would grab in the seconds you might have. These are the calculations of survival, grim and practical. And then the storm passes, or more accurately, it diminishes to a level you can manage. The wind drops from a shriek to a moan, from something unbearable to merely constant. You emerge to survey the damage, what has failed, what must be repaired immediately, what can wait. You see your neighbors emerging too, and there is a shared understanding in the glances you exchange. You have survived another assault. Tomorrow there will be another. The cycle continues through the long months. Wake, repair, endure, sleep lightly, wake again. The wind shapes everything about your existence, from how you build, to how you sleep, to how you think about safety and shelter. It teaches you that strength alone is not enough. The strongest wall will fail if it is rigid. You must build with flexibility, allowing structures to move slightly rather than resisting absolutely. It teaches you that perfection is impossible. Every repair is temporary, every solution partial. You aim not to eliminate problems, but to manage them well enough to survive. It teaches you humility. You are small and the forces of nature are vast, and your best efforts amount to tiny acts of defiance against an indifferent universe. And yet you persist because what else can you do? You persist because spring will come eventually, though it feels impossible during the darkest depths of winter. You persist because other people persist, and their continued existence proves that survival is possible. You persist because the alternative is unthinkable. And so you wake another morning, feel the draft across the floor, and reach for your tools once again. The wind howls outside, uncaring and eternal. You pack moss into gaps with cold, stiffened fingers, knowing it will blow loose again. You bank the fire and hope the chimney draws properly tonight. You hold your children close and listen to the cabin groan around you. This is life in deadly winds, not a single dramatic moment, but an endless accumulation of small battles, small victories, small failures. The wind is always there, always testing. And you are always there too, stubbornly holding the line between inside and outside, between warmth and cold, between survival and surrender. Tomorrow you will wake and begin again, because that is what surviving winter winds demands. An endless, patient, quiet determination to keep standing when everything is pushing you down. The rhythm of your days is dictated entirely by wind, your life organized around its patterns and your responses to them. This is the story of early settlers in deadly winds, not one of glory or adventure, but of repetitive, grinding, necessary labor performed in cold and fear and stubborn hope that tomorrow the wind might ease just slightly, just enough. As the hours drift forward and the wind continues its ancient song, let us turn our attention to a single life. One man whose existence was so deeply intertwined with winter winds that his story became part of the landscape itself. His name, as remembered in the fragmentary records and oral traditions of the region, was Semyon Grigorievich. He was not born into privilege or distinction. His first memories were of a small settlement on the northern frontier, where his family had arrived seeking land and opportunity in the vast Siberian expanse. The settlement was newer then, less established, and the cabins were hastily constructed, walls that leaked wind, roofs that buckled under snow, chimneys that drew poorly. Semyon's childhood was shaped by cold and by the constant presence of wind pushing against every structure. His father worked the land when weather permitted and spent winters repairing what the elements damaged. His mother kept the hearth and mended clothing worn through by harsh conditions. Semyon had 2 younger sisters and an older brother, and they all slept together on a single platform, sharing warmth through the long nights. The cabin they lived in was modest even by frontier standards, and the wind found its way through gaps that seemed to multiply each season. The family had arrived in the region during a period of expansion, part of a wave of settlers drawn by promises of land grants and the possibility of establishing something permanent in a place where permanence seemed almost impossible. Semyon's father had been a laborer in the south, a man with strong hands but little property, and the frontier represented his chance to claim something of his own. The journey north had taken months, traveling by wagon and then by river barge, carrying everything they owned in 2 wooden chests and several bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Semyon remembered fragments of that journey, The smell of the river, the way his mother had held his youngest sister constantly, the faces of other families making the same desperate migration toward uncertain futures. When they arrived at the settlement, it consisted of perhaps 15 cabins scattered across a stretch of land that offered access to both forest and water. The other families had been there one season longer, sometimes two, and they possessed the weary expertise of those who had already survived at least one full winter in conditions that tested every assumption about shelter and survival. Semyon's father had worked alongside neighbors to raise the walls of their cabin in a single, long day of communal labor. The logs were rough-hewn, still bearing bark in places, fitted together with more hope than precision. The gaps between logs were substantial, filled with moss and clay that dried and cracked almost immediately. The roof was constructed from smaller timbers covered with bark, and then a layer of sod, the whole structure designed more for speed than durability. It leaked in the first rain. When winter came, the wind found every weakness, and the family spent their first months in a constant battle against cold that seeped through walls despite their best efforts to seal and insulate. Semyon's mother would rise multiple times each night to feed the fire, understanding that letting it die would mean death for her children. His father worked in darkness before dawn and after dusk, stuffing fresh moss into gaps, nailing strips of bark over the worst cracks, doing everything possible with limited materials and even more limited time. The first winter took its toll in ways both visible and invisible. 2 families in the settlement lost members, an infant who simply did not wake one morning, an elderly man who went out to gather firewood and was found later, frozen, having collapsed within sight of his own door. These deaths were not dramatic or violent, they were quiet surrenders to cold, and they taught the survivors that winter on the frontier was not an adventure, but an adversary that required constant vigilance. Semyon was too young to fully understand death, but he understood the fear he saw in adults' eyes when storms approached. He understood the tension that filled the cabin when the fire burned low and wood supplies ran short. He understood that the walls around him were not truly solid, that they were temporary barriers against forces that could kill him as easily as snuffing a candle. This awareness shaped him differently than it shaped his siblings. His older brother responded to the precariousness of frontier life by growing hard and practical, focused on immediate tasks and impatient with anything that seemed like overthinking. His sisters, when they were old enough to understand their situation, developed a kind of resigned acceptance, treating hardship as simply the nature of existence. But Semyon, from his earliest conscious moments, felt a need to understand the mechanisms of survival, to see beneath the surface of day-to-day routines and grasp the principles that separated success from failure. He watched how frost formed on the inside walls, observed that it accumulated more thickly in certain areas than others. He noticed that wind seemed to push hardest against the northwest corner of the cabin, and that this corner required the most frequent repairs. He saw how snow piled against the north wall in drifts that reached halfway up the structure, and how this snow, paradoxically, sometimes helped insulate against the worst cold. These observations had no immediate practical application for a child, but they were the beginning of an education that would define his life. Semyon was perhaps 7 years old when the event occurred that would define the rest of his life. It was late winter, that treacherous time when people begin to believe the worst has passed, when supplies run lowest and vigilance sometimes wavers. A storm arrived without much warning. The sky darkened in the afternoon, and by evening the wind had risen to a sustained howl. Semyon's family did what they always did. They banked the fire, sealed what gaps they could, and prepared to wait out the night. But this storm was different in its intensity. The wind did not gust and fade, but maintained a constant, terrible pressure against the cabin. Semyon woke in darkness to the sound of wood cracking. Not the usual creaking and groaning, but something sharper, more final. He heard his father shouting, heard his mother gathering the children, felt his sisters pressed against him. The sound of the roof giving way was unlike anything he had experienced before, a cascade of splintering wood that seemed to come from everywhere at once, followed by a terrible crash as the main support beam broke and the entire structure collapsed inward. Cold air rushed in with the force of an avalanche, and snow followed, burying everything in suffocating whiteness. Semyon felt hands grabbing him, pulling him upward through debris and snow. His father's voice was shouting something, but the words were lost in the wind's roar. His mother's face appeared briefly in the darkness, covered with snow, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it transcended normal fear. His brother was crying, or maybe screaming. It was impossible to tell the difference. They made it outside into the full force of the storm, wind so strong it was difficult to stand. Semyon's father held him by the arm, pulling him toward the neighbor's cabin. His mother carried one sister while his brother held the other. They stumbled through snow that the wind drove horizontally, through darkness broken only by occasional glimpses of other lanterns moving in the settlement. The distance to the neighbor's cabin was perhaps 30 paces, but it felt like miles. The wind pushed against them with such force that forward movement required leaning into it at an angle that would have been impossible in calm conditions. Snow stung Semyon's face, got into his mouth and nose, made breathing a conscious effort. His feet disappeared with each step into drifts that were sometimes knee-deep, sometimes deeper, the depth impossible to predict in the darkness. The neighbor took them in, and Semyon's family huddled with others in a cabin already crowded. They stayed there 3 days while the storm continued, then 2 more days after it passed, while the settlement assessed the damage. The cabin was not large enough to comfortably accommodate so many people, but comfort was irrelevant. They shared body heat, shared what food was available, took turns sleeping while others sat against walls to make room. The children were kept in the center, surrounded by adults. The fire was maintained constantly, fed by wood that had to be gathered during brief lulls when the wind dropped enough to make venturing outside survivable. During those 3 days, Semyon learned what it meant to be truly cold, even inside shelter. The cabin they sheltered in was better built than his family's home had been, but it was never designed to house so many people. The fire could not adequately heat the space, and cold settled in corners and along the floor. People wrapped themselves in everything available, blankets, spare clothing, even strips of hide, and still they shivered. When they finally returned to look at what remained of their home, they found the roof collapsed inward, most of their possessions buried under snow and broken timber. The walls still stood, but the heart of the structure was gone. Everything they had carried north, everything they had accumulated in their years in the settlement, was either destroyed or damaged beyond usefulness. His mother's loom was crushed beneath a fallen beam. The wooden chest that had carried their possessions north was split open, its contents scattered and frozen. His father's tools, precious items that had taken years to acquire, were lost in the debris, some broken, others simply vanished into the snow. This was not an uncommon occurrence on the frontier. Families lost homes, rebuilt, lost them again. But for young Semyon, the experience planted something deeper than fear. He had felt the moment when shelter failed, when the thing that was supposed to protect him became a source of danger. He had heard the sound of structural collapse, had felt the instant when security transformed into chaos. And more than anything, he had seen his parents' faces in that moment, had recognized that the adults who were supposed to know what to do were as helpless and terrified as he was. This realization did not break him, but focused him. He became obsessed with understanding how structures failed. He watched as his father and neighbors worked to rebuild, asking questions constantly. Why this joint and not another? Why this angle for the roof? Why pack moss in this particular way? The adults, accustomed to children underfoot, answered patiently at first, and then with growing interest as they realized the boy was genuinely trying to understand principles, not just copying actions. His father, initially dismissive of what seemed like childish curiosity, began to recognize that Semyon was asking questions he himself had not thought to ask. Why did some cabins in the settlement survive storms better than others? Was it simply luck? Or were there patterns that could be identified and replicated? When logs were fitted together, what determined how tightly they sealed? Was it the straightness of the timber, the angle of the cut, the type of chinking material used, or some combination of all these factors? Semyon began to listen to wind differently. Other children heard wind as simple noise, something to be ignored or endured. Semyon heard variations in pitch and intensity, learned to associate certain sounds with certain wind speeds and directions. He discovered he could tell from inside a cabin, just from listening, where wind was finding its way through walls. He would point to a spot and say, "There," and adults would check and find he was usually correct. This skill seemed almost uncanny to some, but it was simply careful attention. Semyon had learned that wind moving through a small gap created a different sound than wind moving around an obstacle, and his young ears caught distinctions others missed. A high whistle meant a narrow crack, perhaps between logs where chinking had failed. A lower, rushing sound indicated a larger opening, maybe around a window frame or door. A rattling suggested something loose, a piece of bark or board that wind was lifting and dropping repeatedly. These distinctions were subtle, easily overlooked by people whose attention was focused on immediate tasks, but to Semyon they were a language that could be learned and interpreted. As he grew into adolescence, his knowledge expanded. He helped with many reconstruction projects, learning from each family's different approaches. He noticed that certain cabins fared better in storms than others, and he began to understand why. A slightly different roof angle, walls oriented to present less surface to prevailing winds, logs selected for straightness and fitted more carefully. Some of this was intentional design, but much was accidental, and Semyon made a study of separating useful techniques from random chance. He observed that cabins built in slight depressions tended to survive better than those on exposed ridges, not just because they were lower, but because the surrounding land created natural wind deflection. He noticed that roofs with steeper pitches shed snow more effectively, preventing dangerous accumulation that added weight to already stressed structures. He saw how the placement of doors and windows affected interior drafts, how a door on the east side of a cabin created different air circulation patterns than one on the south side. These observations accumulated in his mind, forming a body of practical knowledge that was unprecedented in the settlement. By the time he reached manhood, Semyon had developed a reputation throughout the settlement and among neighboring communities. People called him the Wind Reader, a nickname spoken sometimes with respect and sometimes with a hint of mockery, as if there was something slightly odd about a man who spent so much time thinking about invisible forces. But when storms threatened, when families worried about their roofs or walls, they came to Semyon for advice. He would walk around a cabin slowly, sometimes closing his eyes to listen, sometimes pressing his hands against walls to feel vibrations. He would point out weaknesses, a gap that would grow wider, a beam that lacked proper support, a roof section that would fail under the next heavy snow. His recommendations were specific and practical. Reinforce this corner with an additional post, repack all the moss on the north wall before the next storm, add a windbreak of stacked logs 3 paces from the door. People learned that following his advice usually meant fewer problems when winter winds arrived. Those who ignored his recommendations often regretted it when repairs proved necessary during the worst possible conditions. There was something almost prophetic about his assessments, though there was nothing supernatural in his methods, just patient observation, accumulated experience, and a willingness to think systematically about problems that others treated as random misfortune. He kept mental records of failures, noting what went wrong and why, and these records informed his future recommendations. Semyon married when he was 23, taking as his wife a young woman named Ekaterina, whose family had arrived in the settlement only 2 years before. She was practical and strong, qualities essential for frontier life, and she understood that her husband's preoccupation with wind and structure was not oddness, but wisdom. Her own family's cabin had been one that Semyon had helped reinforce during a particularly severe autumn, and she had watched him work with a focus and precision that impressed her. She had seen other men approach building as brute labor, forcing materials into place through strength and stubbornness. Semyon worked differently, fitting pieces together with careful attention to how they would bear weight and resist stress. He wasted less material, and his work lasted longer, and these were virtues that spoke directly to the practical needs of frontier existence. Together they built their own cabin, and Semyon applied everything he had learned. The cabin was positioned in a slight depression where the land offered some natural protection from north winds. The logs were selected individually for straightness, and each was carefully fitted to minimize gaps. The roof was angled more steeply than was common, allowing snow to slide off before accumulating to dangerous weight. The construction took longer than was typical, partly because Semyon refused to compromise on details that others might have overlooked. He rejected logs that had too much taper or twist, even when it meant extra work to find suitable replacements. He insisted on using specific types of moss for chinking, preferring varieties that stayed flexible when dry rather than crumbling. He built the door frame slightly recessed into the wall, creating a small vestibule that reduced direct wind penetration when the door was opened. The chimney was built with a slight curve that Semyon had observed in an old trapper's shelter. The curve created turbulence that prevented wind from blowing directly down the flue. Small details accumulated into a structure that was noticeably more resistant to winter's assaults. When the first major storm of their first winter together arrived, Ekaterina lay awake listening to wind hammer at other cabins while their own remained stable and quiet. And she understood that she had married not just a man, but a philosophy of patient preparation. The cabin was not silent, no structure in that environment could be, but the sounds it made were the sounds of strength being tested and holding, not the sounds of gradual failure. Ekaterina gave birth to their first child, a son, in their second winter together. The baby's arrival brought new anxieties. Infants were particularly vulnerable to cold, and keeping a baby warm and healthy through winter months required constant vigilance. Semyon became even more meticulous about sealing gaps and maintaining the fire. He built a small sleeping enclosure within the cabin, a boxed-in area with felt walls that trapped warmth and protected the baby from drafts. The enclosure was positioned near the stove, but not so close as to risk overheating or fire danger. It had a small opening that could be covered with a hinged panel, allowing Ekaterina to reach the baby without exposing him to the cooler air of the main cabin. Inside, the temperature remained several degrees warmer than the surrounding space, enough of a difference to matter for an infant whose ability to regulate body temperature was still developing. Ekaterina spent most of each day and night in or near this enclosure, emerging only for necessary tasks, and she was grateful for her husband's foresight in designing something that made her constant vigil slightly less exhausting. Their second child, a daughter, arrived 2 years later. The family was growing, and with it grew Semyon's determination to keep them safe. He understood deeply from his own childhood experience how quickly disaster could arrive. Every storm that passed without incident felt like a small victory, but he never relaxed his vigilance. He taught his son, as the boy grew old enough to understand, the same lessons he had learned: how to listen to wind, how to spot structural weakness, how to prioritize repairs. The teaching was not formal or systematic, but woven into daily life. When they worked together on maintenance tasks, Semyon would explain his reasoning, would point out signs of stress or wear that might not be immediately obvious. He taught the boy to look at the underside of roof beams where moisture damage often began. He showed him how to test the firmness of chinking by pressing it with a fingertip, how to recognize when moss needed to be replaced. He explained why certain repairs needed to be done immediately while others could wait, how to assess priorities when time and materials were both limited. The rhythm of Semyon's life fell into a pattern shaped by seasons. Spring and summer were for preparation, cutting timber, gathering moss, making repairs to walls and roofs, while weather permitted. Autumn was for final winterization, a rushed period of activity as the first cold winds arrived. Winter was for maintenance and vigilance, the long, dark months of constant small battles against cold and wind. And always, always, he listened. Even during summer, when winds were warm and gentle, he paid attention to how they moved through the settlement, noting which areas were exposed and which were sheltered. He observed how wind patterns changed with the seasons, how prevailing directions shifted, how temperature and humidity affected the way wind carried sound. This knowledge accumulated like snow in drifts, seemingly insignificant in any single moment, but becoming substantial over time. The settlement grew slowly around them. New families arrived, drawn by stories of available land, and Semyon helped many of them with their building efforts. He gained a reputation that extended beyond the immediate area. Travelers passing through would sometimes seek him out to ask questions about construction techniques. He shared his knowledge freely, understanding that every family that built well increased the overall resilience of the community. Strong cabins meant fewer emergencies, fewer desperate midnight rescues when roofs collapsed. Knowledge was survival, and survival was better when shared. He helped establish informal standards for construction, not through any official authority, but through the persuasive force of demonstrated success. New families would arrive planning to build in ways that Semyon knew from experience would fail, and he would gently suggest modifications, explaining his reasoning with specific examples. Most people listened, though some dismissed his advice as unnecessary caution and later regretted that decision. He never said, "I told you so," when failures occurred, but simply helped with repairs and hoped the lesson would be learned. But Semyon's own family was not immune to misfortune. His wife Ekaterina fell ill during their 8th winter together. It began as a cough, the kind that many people developed in winter from breathing cold air and smoke. But this cough deepened and persisted, and soon she was feverish and weak. Semyon tended to her while also managing the children and the endless demands of maintaining the cabin. For weeks she improved slightly, then worsened again, her strength slowly fading. The settlement had no doctor. There was a woman with knowledge of herbs and traditional remedies, but her treatments brought only marginal relief. Semyon tried everything he could think of, keeping the cabin warmer, preparing special foods, reducing smoke by improving the chimney's draft. Nothing seemed to help in any lasting way. Ekaterina would have good days when she could sit up and talk, when her fever broke and hope returned, and then the cough would worsen again, and she would sink back into weakness. It was during this time, while Ekaterina lay ill and Semyon was stretched thin with worry and labor, that the great storm arrived. Later, people would call it the Night of the Roaring North Wind, and stories about it would be told for generations. The storm built gradually through the afternoon, an unusual pattern that gave people time to prepare. But preparation could only do so much against what was coming. By dusk, the wind had reached a level that made it dangerous to be outside at all. Snow filled the air so thickly that you could not see 3 paces ahead. The temperature dropped rapidly and the wind did not gust but sustained, a constant, overwhelming pressure that felt like a physical presence pushing against every surface. Semyon's cabin, built so carefully, stood firm, but he could hear in the wind's voice that other structures were suffering. He heard the distinctive crack of breaking timber, the crash of collapsing sections, sounds that carried even over the storm's roar. He stood by the window, looking out into darkness made absolute by blowing snow, and he thought of his neighbors, elderly couples, families with small children, cabins he knew had weaknesses that might be failing at this very moment. His mind inventoried the settlement automatically, reviewing which structures were vulnerable and where failures were most likely. The elderly couple with the patched roof that he had warned about in autumn. The young family whose cabin had been built hastily with logs that were not properly seasoned. The widow living alone whose door latch was weak. Each of these situations played out in his imagination, scenarios of collapse and cold and desperate need. Ekaterina lay on the sleeping platform, her breathing labored. Their children huddled nearby, frightened by the storm's intensity. Semyon faced an impossible choice: stay with his sick wife and children where they were safe, or go out into the storm to help others who might be in desperate need. The wind hammered at the walls. The cabin shook but held, testament to his careful construction. His daughter was crying quietly, and his son tried to appear brave, but could not hide his fear. Ekaterina, feverish but aware, looked at him from the bed. She knew her husband well enough to recognize the tension in his posture, the calculation happening behind his eyes. She spoke, her voice barely audible over the wind, and said simply, "Go." In that single word was everything: permission, understanding, acceptance of risk, trust that Semyon would know what to do and that she and the children would manage in his absence. It was perhaps the greatest gift she could have given him, this release from the obligation to choose, though the choice itself remained terrible in its implications. Semyon wrapped himself in every piece of warm clothing he owned, layers of wool and felt, leather outer garments, boots bound tightly, mittens over gloves, a scarf wound around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. He took rope and tools, hammer, wooden wedges, strips of hide for emergency repairs. He lit a lantern, though he knew the wind might extinguish it immediately. He told his son to bar the door behind him and to tend the fire, to not open the door again until Semyon returned or until morning came. The boy nodded, trying to project a confidence he clearly did not feel. Semyon touched his son's head briefly, looked once more at Ekaterina and his daughter, and then he stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him down in the first instant. Snow flew horizontally, stinging any exposed skin, filling his vision with white chaos. The cold was immediate and intense, cutting through his layers. The lantern's flame guttered wildly, but somehow stayed lit, casting a small sphere of dim yellow light that barely penetrated the blowing snow. He could see almost nothing beyond a few arms' lengths. The world had been reduced to a small circle of illuminated snow particles, everything beyond that circle lost in darkness and wind. Semyon knew the settlement's layout by heart. He had walked these paths thousands of times, but in the storm, with no visibility and wind strong enough to push him off course, navigation became a matter of counting steps and feeling for landmarks. He moved toward the nearest cabin, one occupied by an elderly couple he knew had a weak roof section. The distance was perhaps 50 paces, but it took several minutes of struggling forward, leaning into the wind, feeling with his feet for the path. He reached the cabin and pounded on the door. The old man opened it, and Semyon could see immediately that the interior was filled with blowing snow. The roof had partially failed, and wind was tearing through the gap. The couple had piled everything they owned under the one section of roof that still held, huddling there in blankets. Their faces showed relief at Semyon's arrival, but also resignation, as if they had already accepted that this might be their last night. The old woman was shaking. Whether from cold or fear, it was impossible to tell. Semyon climbed onto the roof, working by feel more than sight, and used his tools to wedge boards across the failing section. It was temporary, barely adequate, but it reduced the wind penetration enough that the couple might survive the night. He moved on to the next cabin. Here he found a young family whose door had been blown open, the latch having failed under the wind's pressure. The cabin was filling with snow, and the fire had nearly gone out. Semyon helped them clear the snow, rekindle the fire, and jury-rigged a new latch using rope and wooden pins. The work was done with frozen fingers that barely responded. By the dim light of the lantern, he kept setting down and picking up. The father of the family was young, perhaps 20, and he looked at Semyon with an expression that mixed gratitude with shame at his own inability to handle the emergency. Semyon said nothing about this, simply showed him how the temporary latch worked, and moved on. At the third cabin he found a more serious situation. A support beam had cracked, and the roof was sagging dangerously. The family inside was afraid to move, worried that any shift might cause complete collapse. Semyon crawled into the space between roof and ceiling, a narrow gap filled with cold and insulation material, and used his body and a spare beam to create temporary support. He showed the father of the family how to brace it from below, how to distribute weight with additional posts. The work required him to lie on his back in freezing darkness, pushing upward against massive weight while explaining what needed to be done. His muscles screamed with the effort, and cold seeped through his clothing from the contact with frozen materials. But the roof held, and the family understood what to do, and that was enough. He moved through the settlement this way, from crisis to crisis, each rescue taking time and energy he felt draining from his body. The cold was relentless, working its way through his clothing despite all the layers. His hands lost feeling, then regained it in painful bursts, then lost it again. His face behind the scarf felt like frozen leather. The lantern oil was running low, but he found another lamp at one of the cabins and refilled his own. The night stretched on endlessly. Time lost meaning in the darkness and chaos of the storm. There was only the next cabin, the next emergency, the next temporary repair that might mean the difference between survival and death. He found one cabin where the entire roof had collapsed inward. The family had managed to escape to a neighbor's shelter, and Semyon cleared the doorway enough to retrieve what belongings could be salvaged, piling them inside a nearby shed. He found another where wind had torn through the north wall, opening a gap large enough to crawl through. He patched it with hides and boards nailed in place, working while snow accumulated on his back. Each repair was crude, makeshift, designed only to last until morning. But crude repairs that held were infinitely better than no repairs at all. At some point, he could not have said what hour, the wind began to diminish. It did not stop, but it dropped from unbearable to merely severe. The snow continued falling, but no longer flew horizontally. Visibility improved slightly, enough that Semyon could see the dark shapes of other cabins against the lesser darkness of the sky. He was exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced. Every movement required conscious effort. His muscles ached, his hands were raw despite the mittens, and he was colder than he could ever remember being. But he continued moving through the settlement, checking on each cabin, making sure no one had been missed. He knocked on doors and asked if everyone was safe, if any repairs were needed. Most cabins had survived intact, their inhabitants grateful, but safe. Others had suffered damage but had managed temporary repairs on their own. Semyon noted each situation, already planning the permanent repairs that would be needed once the storm passed fully. Finally, as the first grey hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Semyon turned toward home. The walk back to his own cabin felt impossibly long, though the distance was short. His legs barely held him. The rope he had brought hung from his belt, most of it unused. His tools were scattered through the settlement, left at various sites where emergency repairs continued to hold. He reached his door and knocked weakly, and his son unbarred it from within. Semyon stumbled inside into warmth that felt almost painful against his frozen skin. He had been outside for perhaps 7 hours, maybe longer. He had lost track completely. His children helped him remove the frozen outer layers of clothing. His wife, still feverish but conscious, watched from the bed with an expression of relief mixed with worry. She could see the toll the night had taken, could see how close her husband had come to not returning at all. But she said nothing, understanding that any words would be inadequate to the moment. Semyon collapsed beside the fire, too tired to speak, and fell into a sleep that was less rest than unconsciousness. He woke later that day to find that word of his efforts had spread through the settlement. People came to thank him, to tell him that his repairs had held through the remainder of the storm, that without his intervention their situations would have been much worse. 2 families might have frozen to death in their damaged cabins. Others might have lost everything to collapsed structures. The elderly couple with the weak roof survived because Semyon had reinforced it in the darkest hours of the night. But Semyon took little comfort in the gratitude. He had made a choice, and the cost of that choice was time away from his sick wife, hours when she had lain ill, while he tended to strangers. The fact that she had survived the night, that his children had managed the fire and kept safe, felt more like luck than anything earned. What if Ekaterina's condition had worsened while he was gone? What if his son, only 10 years old, had let the fire die or had opened the door to danger? The gratitude of neighbors was real, but it felt hollow against these alternative possibilities. Ekaterina recovered slowly over the following weeks, her strength gradually returning as winter loosened its grip. The settlement too recovered. Permanent repairs replaced Semyon's emergency patches, roofs were rebuilt, walls were reinforced, and people prepared for the next winter with renewed determination and improved knowledge. The storm had been a harsh teacher, but the lessons were learned. People built with steeper roofs, stronger door latches, better supported beams. The collective knowledge of the settlement increased, and this increase translated directly into improved survival odds for everyone. Semyon's methods, once viewed with some skepticism, became standard practice. Semyon continued his work as before, but something had shifted in how people viewed him. He was no longer simply the eccentric man who listened to wind. He was the person who had risked his life in impossible conditions to keep others safe. His knowledge was sought even more frequently, and neighboring settlements sent messages asking him to visit and advise on building projects. He declined most such requests, preferring to stay close to his family, but his reputation grew nonetheless. Stories about that night spread beyond the immediate region, becoming part of the collective memory of frontier communities. People who had not been there claimed to remember it, claimed to have heard the wind or seen Semyon working in the storm. The actual events were dramatic enough without embellishment, But embellishment came anyway, as it always does with stories that matter to people. In some versions, Semyon saved a dozen families. In others, he battled supernatural forces embodied in the wind itself. But those who had actually been there remembered a simpler truth. A man moving methodically through impossible conditions, doing what needed to be done because no one else could or would. Years passed, and Semyon's children grew. His son became skilled in construction and wind reading, learning from his father's patient instruction. The boy had his father's careful attention to detail, but also a natural mechanical aptitude that allowed him to understand structural principles more quickly than Semyon had. Together they worked on increasingly complex projects, father and son developing techniques that neither could have developed alone. His daughter married a man from a neighboring settlement and moved away, though she visited when weather permitted. She had inherited none of her father's technical skills, but all of his determination and careful observation, qualities she applied to managing a household in conditions only marginally less harsh than those of her childhood. Ekaterina's health remained fragile. The illness had weakened her permanently, but she lived many more years. Semyon cared for her with the same meticulous attention he gave to maintaining their cabin. He adjusted his workload to ensure he was present when she needed help, delegated more tasks to his son, accepted that he could not personally oversee every building project in the settlement. His wife's illness had taught him something about limits, about the fact that one man could not solve every problem no matter how determined or skilled. The settlement continued evolving around them. New techniques arrived with new settlers, and Semyon adapted his methods, always learning, always refining. He experimented with different types of chinking materials, different roof configurations, different ways of positioning cabins to take advantage of natural windbreaks. Some experiments failed, and he learned from those failures. Others succeeded, and he shared those successes with anyone who asked. He kept no secrets. Every piece of knowledge that helped someone build a stronger cabin was knowledge that increased the community's chances of survival. He began keeping written records, crude notes and sketches that documented his observations and techniques. These were not formal technical drawings, but practical reminders, angles that worked, materials that lasted, common failure points to watch for. As we drift deeper into the night, let us turn from the known stories to the mysteries that remain, to the questions archaeologists and historians still puzzle over when they examine the remnants of these frontier settlements. There are structures that survived, fragments that tell incomplete stories, techniques whose origins fade into uncertainty. In the ruins of old cabins scattered across the Siberian frontier, researchers have found construction details that resist simple explanation. These are not the grand mysteries of lost civilizations, but quiet enigmas embedded in everyday survival, the kind of puzzles that emerge when you look closely at how people adapted to wind. One of the most intriguing discoveries involves the interior surfaces of certain log walls. When archaeologists carefully excavated collapsed cabins from the 18th and 19th centuries, they occasionally found logs with shallow grooves carved into their inner faces, patterns of parallel channels, sometimes straight, sometimes curved, running along the length of the timber. These grooves are deliberately made, shaped with tools, not natural features of the wood. They appear in cabins scattered across a wide region, suggesting some shared knowledge or practice. But their purpose remains debated. One theory suggests they are functional, that the grooves were designed to trap moving air and reduce the whistling sound wind makes when it penetrates walls. Air flowing through a small gap creates noise, and perhaps these channels somehow disrupted or absorbed that sound, making the interior quieter. Tests with reconstructed models have shown mixed results. Some groove patterns do seem to reduce certain frequencies of wind noise, but the effect is subtle. Another theory proposes these grooves held some kind of insulating material. Perhaps dried moss or felt strips were pressed into the channels, creating an additional barrier against cold. But few traces of such materials remain, and it's unclear why this method would be superior to simply packing moss between the logs as was commonly done. A third interpretation is more speculative, that the grooves held cultural or spiritual significance, perhaps related to beliefs about protecting the home from malevolent forces. In several indigenous traditions of the region, wind was associated with spirits, and certain patterns were thought to confuse or deflect negative energies. The grooves might have been a form of protective marking, a way of sanctifying the boundary between inside and outside. Without written records explaining the practice, we are left with physical evidence and uncertain interpretation. The grooves exist, they were deliberately made, but their true purpose has been lost to time. Perhaps different families carved them for different reasons, some practical, some spiritual, some simply following tradition without fully understanding why. This uncertainty is itself a kind of poetry, a reminder that even the most mundane aspects of historical life can become mysterious when enough time passes. The act of carving these grooves would have taken considerable effort. Each channel represents hours of patient work with chisel or knife, scraping away wood fiber by fiber until the desired depth and shape were achieved. Someone decided this labor was worth the investment, that whatever benefit the grooves provided justified the time taken from other essential tasks. We can imagine a settler working by firelight during the long winter months, methodically carving these patterns into walls already standing, or perhaps preparing logs before assembly, knowing that this detail mattered for reasons we can now only guess. The distribution of grooved logs across different sites reveals patterns that are themselves puzzling. Some cabins show grooves on all interior walls, a comprehensive treatment that suggests the practice was considered essential. Other cabins have grooves only on north-facing walls or only in certain rooms, implying selective application based on some criterion we cannot fully determine. A few cabins show what appears to be experimental variation, different groove patterns in different sections, as if the builder were testing multiple approaches to see which worked best. This experimental quality is particularly intriguing because it suggests individual innovation rather than the mere replication of an established technique. When modern acoustics engineers have analyzed these groove patterns using contemporary measurement tools, they have found that certain configurations do indeed affect sound propagation in measurable ways. The parallel channels create a series of small, resonant cavities that can dampen specific frequencies, particularly the high-pitched whistling that occurs when wind forces its way through narrow gaps. However, the effect is only significant for grooves of particular depths and spacing, and many of the archaeological examples do not conform to these optimal dimensions. This raises the question of whether the builders understood the acoustic principles involved, or whether they were following a tradition whose original reasoning had been partially lost. Perhaps the first person to carve these grooves discovered the effect accidentally and then shared the technique with others, but in the transmission, the precise specifications that made it work were not fully communicated. Perhaps the grooves had originally served one purpose but were retained for different reasons as the practice spread. Another persistent puzzle involves the positioning and construction of chimneys in certain frontier cabins. Most chimneys were built as straight as possible. A direct vertical channel is the most efficient for drawing smoke upward, but excavations have revealed a significant number of chimneys that incorporate deliberate bends or curves. These are not the result of poor construction or settling over time, but intentional design features built into the structure from the beginning. The question is why anyone would add complexity to something that works better when kept simple. One practical explanation relates to wind direction. A straight chimney can act like a funnel when wind blows directly across the top, creating downdrafts that push smoke back into the cabin. A curved chimney creates turbulence that might disrupt this effect, preventing or reducing backdraft. Some builders in the region seem to understand this principle, positioning a bend in the chimney at a specific height to create the desired turbulence. But not all curved chimneys follow this pattern. Some have bends that seem to serve no obvious aerodynamic purpose. Some curve toward the prevailing wind rather than away from it. Some incorporate multiple changes in direction that would seem to reduce efficiency rather than improve it. When researchers have attempted to reconstruct the logic behind these designs, they often find themselves reaching conclusions that are speculative at best. Perhaps some curves were necessary because of how the cabin's interior space was arranged. A chimney might need to bend to avoid a roof beam or to position the hearth in a particular location. Perhaps some were the result of repairs or modifications made years after initial construction, adding sections that had to work around existing structures. Or perhaps some builders simply preferred curved chimneys for reasons that had nothing to do with function, aesthetic preference, cultural tradition, or personal superstition. The construction of a curved chimney requires significantly more skill than building a straight one, particularly when working with stone or clay materials that must maintain structural integrity while changing direction. The mason or builder needed to calculate angles carefully to ensure that each section of the curve would support the weight above it and channel smoke effectively without creating pockets where creosote could accumulate dangerously. This level of craftsmanship implies either extensive experience or knowledge passed down from skilled mentors, yet we find curved chimneys in remote settlements where such expertise should theoretically have been rare. Perhaps some builders had worked on larger structures elsewhere before moving to the frontier, bringing sophisticated techniques to humble cabins. Perhaps there existed an informal network of itinerant craftsmen who traveled between settlements, trading their skills for food and shelter. Or perhaps the skills were learned through trial and error, with failed chimneys being rebuilt until the correct approach was discovered through painful experience. The materials used in chimney construction also vary in ways that suggest both resource constraints and deliberate choice. Some chimneys are built entirely of stone, carefully fitted together with clay mortar. Others use a combination of stone for the base and clay for the upper sections, a practical compromise that conserves scarce stone while still providing adequate support. A few chimneys incorporate fired bricks, presumably brought from distant locations at considerable expense or effort, used sparingly at critical points like the throat or cap. The decision to invest in imported materials for a chimney suggests that the structure was considered critically important, worth allocating precious resources even when so many other needs competed for attention. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Evenki, Yakut, and others who had lived with Siberian winters for countless generations before Russian settlers arrived, had their own sophisticated understanding of wind and shelter. Some of their knowledge was adopted by settlers, creating a hybrid tradition that blended European building techniques with indigenous wisdom. But the exact nature of this cultural exchange, and which specific practices originated where, is often difficult to determine from the archaeological record. The Evenki had detailed knowledge of wind patterns passed down through oral tradition. They could predict storms by observing animal behavior, by noting changes in how smoke rose from fires, by feeling shifts in air pressure that settlers often missed. They positioned their temporary shelters, conical structures covered in hide or bark, with careful attention to wind direction, always leaving the entrance facing away from prevailing winds. They used natural features of the landscape, stands of trees, rock formations, slight depressions in the ground, to create wind breaks that made exposed locations more habitable. Settlers learned from this knowledge, adapting some practices to their own needs. The use of packed snow against cabin walls for insulation was likely influenced by indigenous techniques. The practice of creating windbreaks from stacked logs or woven branches borrowed from Evenki methods of managing airflow around their camps. But the cultural transmission was not one-directional. Indigenous peoples also adopted some settler techniques, particularly the construction of more permanent log structures that could withstand years of use. The result was a complex weaving of knowledge systems and untangling which threads came from which tradition is often impossible. The Evenki concept of reading the land for signs of wind behavior was far more nuanced than simple meteorological observation. They understood that wind flowed like water, seeking paths of least resistance through valleys and around obstacles, creating predictable patterns that could be learned and anticipated. An experienced Evenki hunter could stand in an unfamiliar location and, by observing the shapes of trees, the drift patterns of snow, the exposure of rocks, reconstruct the typical wind flows for that place across different seasons. This knowledge was practical survival skill. Setting a camp in the wrong location could mean a miserable night, or, in extreme conditions, death by exposure. Settlers who learned to read these signs gained a significant advantage in selecting building sites and orienting structures for maximum protection. The Evenki also understood the relationship between wind and animal behavior in ways that settlers initially dismissed as superstition, but gradually came to respect. Reindeer herds would shift their grazing patterns days before major storms, moving to more sheltered areas in response to cues that humans could not directly perceive. Birds would alter their flight paths, and even insects would change their activity levels. An Evenki elder could predict weather changes with remarkable accuracy simply by watching how foxes dug their dens or noting the restlessness of horses. Settlers who paid attention to these teachings found them empirically reliable, even if the underlying mechanisms remained mysterious to them. The Evenki had spiritual beliefs about wind that were deeply integrated with their practical knowledge. Wind was not simply a weather phenomenon, but a manifestation of spirits that inhabited the land. These spirits, sometimes called buga, meaning sky or heaven in the Evenki language, were associated with different directions and different qualities. North wind was particularly powerful and dangerous, associated with cold and hardship. South wind was gentler, bringing warmth and change. Rituals existed for appeasing or communicating with these wind spirits, including offerings of food or tobacco smoke released in specific directions. Doors were positioned not just for practical reasons, but according to beliefs about which directions were spiritually safe. Some directions were considered unlucky or dangerous to face while sleeping, and interior arrangements reflected these concerns. Smoke from the hearth was observed carefully. Certain patterns of smoke movement were seen as messages or warnings from spirits. When Russian settlers arrived with their Orthodox Christianity, these indigenous beliefs about wind spirits were sometimes condemned as pagan superstition. But in practice, many settlers hedged their bets, outwardly following Christian teachings while privately incorporating indigenous practices that seemed to work. A settler might pray to Orthodox saints for protection, but also position his door according to Evenki tradition, or make small offerings during particularly dangerous storms, even while telling himself it was merely folk custom rather than spiritual practice. This blending of belief systems is evident in some of the archaeological sites. Orthodox icons have been found in cabins that also show clear evidence of indigenous construction techniques. Some cabins have door orientations that follow Evenki principles, but crosses carved into the lintels. The spiritual landscape of the frontier was as hybrid as its practical knowledge, combining elements from different traditions into something new. The synthesis of Orthodox Christianity and indigenous spirituality created a folk religion that existed in the shadows of official doctrine, never formally acknowledged but widely practiced. Settlers might make the sign of the cross before entering their homes, but they also observed taboos about speaking certain words when the north wind blew, believing that the wind carried voices to spirits who might take offense. They celebrated Christian holidays with prescribed rituals, but they also maintained indigenous practices around the winter solstice, when the balance between light and darkness hung most precariously. These dual practices were not necessarily seen as contradictory by the people who observed them. In a world where survival was uncertain and forces beyond human control determined life and death, it made practical sense to seek protection from any source that might offer it. The clergy who occasionally visited these remote settlements expressed dismay at such syncretism, but their influence was limited and intermittent. For the people living on the frontier, faith was pragmatic. They took comfort and guidance wherever it could be found, weaving together disparate traditions into a personal theology that addressed their immediate needs. One of the most intriguing unsolved mysteries involves narrow trenches discovered around the perimeters of certain cabins. These trenches are typically 10 to 20 centimeters wide and roughly the same depth, running in straight or gently curved lines at a distance of 1 to 3 meters from the cabin walls. They are clearly deliberate constructions dug with tools, not natural erosion patterns, but their purpose is unclear and different sites show variations that make a single explanation difficult. Some researchers have proposed that these trenches were wind management features, channels designed to redirect airflow away from the cabin walls. Wind hitting a wall creates turbulence and pressure that can force air through gaps. A trench positioned correctly might alter the wind's path, reducing this pressure. Scale models and computer simulations have shown this is theoretically possible, though the trenches would need to be positioned very precisely to have significant effect. Other interpretations are less aerodynamic and more practical in different ways. The trenches might have been drainage features, channels to carry snowmelt away from the foundation to prevent water damage. They might have been barriers against animals, small predators or rodents that might try to dig under walls. They might have been the foundation lines for fences that once stood, but have since rotted away completely, leaving only the trenches where posts were originally placed. A more speculative theory suggests the trenches had spiritual significance, representing a protective boundary around the home. In some shamanistic traditions of Siberia, circles and lines drawn around dwellings were thought to create barriers against harmful spirits or negative forces. The trenches might be physical manifestations of this belief, literal lines of protection carved into the earth. The fact that not all cabins have these trenches, and that those that do show inconsistent patterns, suggests multiple explanations might all be partially correct. Perhaps some families dug them for drainage, others for wind management, others for spiritual protection. Perhaps the same trench served multiple purposes, both practical and symbolic. Or perhaps the trenches mean something entirely different, something we have not yet imagined because we lack the cultural context to understand. The labor involved in digging these trenches should not be underestimated. Even in summer, when the ground was not frozen, digging a trench several meters long through soil filled with rocks and roots would have required hours of backbreaking work. In many locations, the top layer of soil was thin, quickly giving way to permafrost or dense clay that resisted the shovel. Someone deemed this effort worthwhile, prioritizing trench digging over the countless other tasks that demanded attention on a frontier homestead. This suggests that whatever purpose the trenches served was considered important enough to justify significant labor investment, which makes the ambiguity of their function all the more frustrating for researchers trying to understand frontier life. The mystery of the trenches reminds us that archaeological evidence, no matter how carefully examined, cannot always provide definitive answers. We see what remains after centuries of decay and change, and we try to reconstruct the intentions and beliefs of people who left few written records. Sometimes we succeed, but sometimes we are left with intriguing possibilities rather than certainties. Material culture, the physical objects and structures people leave behind, tells us much about how they lived, but it cannot always tell us why they made the choices they made. The positioning of these trenches in relation to other landscape features sometimes reveals patterns that hint at underlying logic without fully explaining it. Trenches often run parallel to the prevailing wind direction rather than perpendicular to it, which seems counterintuitive if their purpose was to deflect wind. They sometimes align with slight slopes in the terrain, which supports the drainage theory, but in other cases they run across flat ground where drainage would be less of a concern. Some trenches have been found to contain traces of ash or charcoal, suggesting they might have been periodically burned, perhaps to control insects or vegetation, but this practice is not consistent across all sites. Each new detail discovered adds complexity rather than clarity, like finding more pieces of a puzzle, only to realize that pieces from several different puzzles have been mixed together. Another category of mystery involves the materials used for chinking between logs. Most cabins used moss as the primary chinking material. It was abundant, effective, and relatively easy to work with. But chemical analysis of residues found in some cabin ruins has revealed more complex mixtures. Some chinking contained moss mixed with clay, as would be expected, but others contain traces of animal fat, charcoal, plant fibers that are not moss, and in a few cases, substances that researchers have been unable to identify with certainty. These mystery compounds might be derived from local plants, resins from certain trees, or organic materials that have degraded beyond recognition. The presence of animal fat in chinking makes sense as a waterproofing agent. Fat would help seal the mixture and prevent moisture penetration. Charcoal might have been added for color to help the chinking blend with darkened logs, or possibly for its absorbent properties. But the unidentified organic compounds remain puzzling. Were they deliberate additives, materials chosen for specific beneficial properties? Or were they simply whatever was available thrown into the mixture because anything that added bulk and adhesion was potentially useful? Without recipes or written descriptions, we can only guess. The variation in chinking composition across different sites suggests that there was no single standard formula, but rather a tradition of experimentation and adaptation. Each family or community developed their own mixture based on available materials and accumulated experience. What worked in one microclimate might not work in another. What one family considered essential might be unknown to their neighbors a few kilometers away. This decentralized experiential approach to problem solving meant that knowledge was sometimes lost when families moved or died, and innovations that might have benefited many people remained localized. The frontier was not a place of systematic scientific development, but of trial and error, with successes sometimes poorly documented and failures often unmarked. The process of preparing and applying chinking was labor-intensive and time-sensitive work that required judgment and skill. The mixture needed to have the right consistency. Too wet, and it would slump out of the gaps before drying. Too dry, and it would not adhere properly, or would crack as it cured. The gaps between logs were irregular, wider in some places than others, and the chinking needed to be packed firmly enough to stay in place, but not so forcefully that it pushed the logs apart. In cold weather, the materials might freeze before they could be properly set, while in warm weather they might dry too quickly and shrink away from the wood. An experienced builder developed an intuitive feel for the work, adjusting the mixture and technique based on temperature, humidity, and the specific characteristics of the logs being sealed. Some of the mystery compounds detected in chinking analysis might represent local plant materials that were known to frontier inhabitants but have since disappeared from common knowledge. The Siberian taiga contains thousands of plant species, many of which have properties that could be useful in construction: natural resins, fibers with particular elasticity, leaves or bark with insect-repelling qualities. Indigenous peoples had encyclopedic knowledge of local flora, understanding which plants could be used for medicine, food, cordage, dye, and construction. Settlers who learned from indigenous neighbors might have incorporated specific plant additives into their chinking mixtures, using materials whose names and properties were never written down because they were simply part of everyday knowledge. When those settlers died and their children moved away, the knowledge died with them, leaving only chemical traces that modern science can detect but not fully identify. Researchers have also found evidence of structural modifications that are difficult to interpret. Some cabins show signs of interior walls being added years after initial construction, dividing single rooms into smaller spaces. The practical reason for this might be heat conservation. Smaller spaces are easier to warm. But the way these walls are positioned sometimes seems odd, creating awkward layouts or blocking convenient pathways. Perhaps they served purposes beyond simple heat management. Perhaps they provided privacy for growing families, or separated sleeping areas from work areas, or created psychological boundaries that mattered to the inhabitants. Or perhaps they were responses to specific problems. A section of outer wall that leaked badly might have been backed by an interior wall that created a buffer zone, sacrificing some floor space to gain better insulation. The archaeological evidence shows what was built, but the reasoning behind it requires inference and imagination. Some cabins have unusual roof structures that seem over-engineered for normal conditions. Extra support beams, redundant bracing, reinforcements that would have required significant additional labor to install. Were these built by people who had experienced catastrophic roof failures and were determined not to repeat the experience? Were they the work of builders who had access to extra timber and decided to use it rather than waste it? Were they influenced by stories or warnings about particularly severe storms that might come? The structures exist, standing testament to someone's decision to build stronger than necessary, but we cannot know what fear or knowledge motivated that choice. The evidence of structural reinforcement sometimes tells dramatic stories, even if those stories remain incomplete. A cabin where all the roof beams have been doubled suggests that the original roof failed catastrophically, possibly collapsing under snow load or wind pressure, forcing a complete rebuild that incorporated lessons learned from disaster. The labor involved in removing a collapsed roof and installing a new one with heavier timbers would have been immense, particularly if the work had to be done quickly to restore shelter before another storm arrived. The family that undertook this work knew viscerally the consequences of inadequate construction, and they built the second time with a determination born of having survived near disaster. Other cabins show less dramatic but still significant reinforcements. Additional posts added to support sagging beams, extra bracing installed at joints that showed signs of weakness, supplementary rafters wedged into place wherever gaps suggested vulnerability. The mystery extends to community planning as well. Some settlements show clear evidence of coordinated planning, cabins positioned in relation to each other in patterns that suggest collective decision-making about layout. Other settlements appear more haphazard, with cabins placed wherever individual families chose. But even in seemingly random layouts, closer examination sometimes reveals subtle patterns. Cabins might be clustered in ways that create shared windbreaks. They might be positioned so that doors face a common area, facilitating social interaction. They might avoid certain areas of land, not for any obvious practical reason. The soil is no different, the drainage no worse, but perhaps because of beliefs or traditions that mark those areas as unlucky or unsuitable. Distinguishing between practical planning and cultural preference is difficult when we lack the voices of the planners themselves. The social dynamics of settlement planning would have been complex, involving negotiations between families about who would build where, what resources could be shared, and how the community would arrange itself in space. In planned settlements, someone needed to take a leadership role in coordinating construction, perhaps an elder whose experience was respected or a religious figure whose authority was acknowledged. In more organic settlements, the first families to arrive claimed the most desirable locations, and later arrivals had to make do with what remained. But even in these seemingly unplanned developments, social relationships shaped spatial arrangements. Families that were related or on friendly terms would choose to build near each other, creating clusters of mutual support. Families in conflict would maintain distance, creating gaps in the settlement pattern that reflected social divisions. The role of women in developing wind resistance techniques is another area where evidence is fragmentary and interpretation uncertain. Historical records from this period, when they exist at all, were typically written by men and focused on men's activities. But women were intimately involved with maintaining cabins. They were inside more consistently than men. They managed the hearth fires. They would have been acutely aware of drafts and heat loss. Some researchers have argued that many innovations in chinking and interior weatherproofing likely came from women's observations and experiments, even if credit was given to men or the innovations passed into general knowledge without attribution. The archaeological record cannot definitively answer this question, but it reminds us to think carefully about whose knowledge and labor created the survival strategies we study. Women's work on the frontier was relentless and essential, yet it often went unrecorded because it was considered ordinary domestic activity rather than noteworthy achievement. A woman might spend days preparing and applying chinking, working her way around the entire cabin to ensure every gap was sealed before winter arrived. She would have been the one to notice which sections failed first, which materials held up best, which techniques provided the most effective seal. If she discovered an improvement, adding a particular plant fiber that made the mixture more flexible, or a specific ratio of fat to clay that resisted cracking, this knowledge would be shared informally with other women, passed along through demonstration and conversation rather than formal instruction. When the men gathered to discuss construction techniques, they might well have been synthesizing and implementing innovations that women had already discovered through practical experimentation. But the historical record written by men would attribute the techniques to male builders, erasing the female contribution from the documented history, even as those contributions remained embedded in the physical structures. One particularly evocative mystery involves what might be called ritual deposits, small collections of objects found buried near cabin foundations or under thresholds. These caches typically contain a few items: coins, beads, small metal objects, sometimes animal bones or teeth, occasionally written prayers or blessings on scraps of paper or wood. The practice of placing protective objects at thresholds is ancient and widespread across many cultures, a form of sympathetic magic meant to guard the home. But the specific combinations of objects found in Siberian frontier cabins sometimes seem idiosyncratic, mixing Orthodox Christian symbols with indigenous talismans with everyday objects that have no obvious symbolic meaning. A cache might contain an Orthodox cross, a bear claw, 3 iron nails, and a button. What did this combination mean to the person who assembled it? Was each item significant, or was the act of burial itself what mattered? Were these family traditions passed down through generations, or personal innovations? The objects are silent, and the meanings they held have evaporated like morning mist. The careful placement of these caches suggests ritual intention. They are not random debris, but deliberately assembled collections placed with purpose. The person who buried these objects took time to select specific items, to arrange them in a particular way, to dig a small cavity at a meaningful location, and to cover them carefully. This was not casual or careless action, but a ceremonial act that mattered to the person performing it, perhaps a prayer made tangible, a hope for protection crystallized in physical form. The blending of Christian and indigenous symbols in these deposits reflects the religious syncretism that characterized frontier life. An Orthodox believer who also respected the spiritual power attributed to bear claws was not necessarily confused or inconsistent, but rather pragmatic, seeking protection from multiple sources without worrying overly about doctrinal compatibility. The frontier was a place where abstract theological distinctions mattered less than practical results, and if both the Christian cross and the indigenous talisman contributed to family safety, then both deserved a place in the foundation deposit. Archaeologists also debate the question of whether certain construction techniques spread through active teaching or through observation and imitation. When similar structural features appear across a wide geographic area, Does this indicate traveling craftsmen who carried knowledge from place to place? Does it suggest a common source, a particularly influential builder whose techniques were deliberately adopted by others? Or does it simply mean that similar environmental pressures led different people to similar solutions independently? All three explanations are probably true for different features at different times, but distinguishing which is which for any specific technique is often impossible. The evidence allows multiple narratives, and honest scholarship requires acknowledging this ambiguity rather than forcing certainty where none exists. The question of knowledge transmission becomes particularly interesting when we find sophisticated techniques in remote, isolated settlements where access to expertise should have been minimal. How did a family, homesteading alone, days of travel from the nearest neighbor, acquire the skills to build curved chimneys or to carve acoustic grooves into interior walls? Perhaps they carried that knowledge with them from wherever they came, trained by master builders before they ventured into the wilderness. Perhaps they learned through painful trial and error, watching techniques fail and slowly developing better approaches through experimentation. Perhaps knowledge traveled in unexpected ways, through casual conversations at trading posts, through observation during brief visits to other settlements, through stories and descriptions that conveyed general principles even if they lacked specific details. The indigenous contribution to frontier building techniques is particularly difficult to trace with precision because much indigenous knowledge was oral rather than written, transmitted through demonstration and practice rather than documents. When a settler learned a technique from an Evenki neighbor, that knowledge might be incorporated into the settler's own practices and passed to his children, eventually becoming Russian technique, with the indigenous origin forgotten or unacknowledged. This is not necessarily deliberate erasure. Cultural borrowing often obscures its own history simply through the process of transmission. A useful technique becomes the way we do things, and asking where it originally came from may not occur to people focused on immediate survival. But the result is that the historical record gives an incomplete picture of the complex exchanges that occurred on the frontier. Modern researchers try to reconstruct these exchanges by comparing archaeological evidence with ethnographic studies of indigenous practices, by analyzing oral histories, by looking for anomalies in the Russian building tradition that might indicate borrowed elements. But much remains uncertain, and the full story of how different knowledge systems merged on the frontier will probably never be completely known. The process of cultural borrowing and adaptation was gradual and organic, happening through countless small interactions rather than through formal instruction or deliberate programs of knowledge transfer. An Evenki hunter might mention casually how his people positioned their shelters to avoid wind, and a settler listening might incorporate that principle into his own building plans without consciously thinking of it as indigenous knowledge. It simply became part of what he knew about surviving in this landscape. An Evenki woman might show a settler's wife how to identify a particular plant useful for chinking, and that knowledge would pass into the settler family's practice, eventually shared with other settler families who might never know its origin. There are also mysteries of absence, techniques that seem obvious to us but that apparently were not used, or were used rarely. Metal weather stripping, for instance, could have sealed gaps around doors and windows far more effectively than rags or leather strips, and metal was available if expensive. Why was this apparently not a common practice? Double-walled construction with an air gap between inner and outer walls for insulation is occasionally found in higher status buildings but seems rare in common cabins. Was this simply a matter of cost and labor, or were there other factors? When we ask why something was not done, we enter even more speculative territory than when we try to explain what was done. Perhaps the absence of a technique indicates it was never thought of. Perhaps it was tried and found less effective than it seems it should be. Perhaps it was known but considered too expensive or too difficult for most people to implement. Perhaps cultural factors we do not understand made certain solutions unacceptable or unthinkable, Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the saying goes, and the things we do not find in the archaeological record might be as significant as the things we do find, if only we could reliably interpret what that absence means. The question of why metal weather stripping was not widely used is particularly puzzling, given that metal was indeed available and was used for other purposes like hinges, nails, and tools. Perhaps the problem was not availability but workability. Shaping metal into thin, flexible strips that could be fitted around irregular door and window frames would have required specialized tools and skills that most frontier settlers lacked. Perhaps the metal available was too thick or too brittle for this application, or perhaps the effort of metalworking was better spent on other needs that could not be met any other way. As we sit here in the quiet hours contemplating these mysteries, there is something almost meditative about the uncertainty. We have fragments of structures, traces of materials, patterns that suggest intention without revealing full meaning. We know that people survived, that they developed effective techniques for living with deadly winds, that they passed some knowledge forward across generations. But the complete picture remains obscured, like trying to see through a window frosted with ice. The frost itself is beautiful. The mystery has its own appeal. We stand at a distance of centuries, looking back at lives lived in hardship, trying to understand not just what people did, but why and how they thought about what they did. The wind that howled through those cabins has long since dissipated into the atmosphere. The walls have collapsed, the roofs have rotted, the people who built and inhabited these structures have returned to dust. What remains are these fragments, these traces, these unanswered questions, and perhaps that is enough to know that people faced deadly winds with intelligence and determination, that they experimented and adapted, that they borrowed and blended knowledge from different traditions. The specific details may elude us, but the general truth is clear. Humans are remarkably good at survival, at finding ways to persist in conditions that seem impossible. The mysteries that remain are reminders of how much human ingenuity exists in quiet, undocumented forms. Not every innovation is written down or remembered. Not every effective technique leaves clear evidence of its principles. The frontier was full of small victories and small insights that allowed life to continue in harsh conditions, most of them never recorded, never celebrated, simply lived and then forgotten. We honor those unknown innovations by acknowledging our own ignorance, by saying honestly that we do not know everything, that the past holds its secrets despite our best efforts to uncover them. There is a profound humility required in historical research, particularly when studying periods and places that left few written records. We must resist the temptation to fill gaps in our knowledge with confident assertions, to mistake our interpretations for facts, to construct narratives that are neat and complete when the evidence is fragmentary and ambiguous. The honest researcher says, "We don't know" far more often than we know, and takes care to distinguish between what the evidence clearly shows and what seems probable based on inference. The mysteries of the Siberian frontier demand this humility. They remind us that the past is not a puzzle that can be completely solved, not a story with a definitive ending, but rather a vast landscape in which we can explore only small corners. And even there, our vision is limited by time's erosion of the evidence. The people who lived on this frontier possessed knowledge that we can barely glimpse. They understood their environment in ways that cannot be fully reconstructed from the material remnants they left behind. They made choices based on considerations, practical, cultural, spiritual, that we can only partially comprehend. To study their lives is to engage in an act of imagination constrained by evidence, to build provisional understandings that remain always open to revision. The grooved logs, the curved chimneys, the mysterious trenches, the ritual deposits, each of these is a doorway into questions we cannot fully answer, a reminder that human experience extends far beyond what any historian can capture. The wind continues to blow across the Siberian frontier, moving over the ruins of old settlements, whispering through collapsed timbers and empty spaces where cabins once stood. If we listen carefully to that wind, perhaps we hear echoes of the knowledge that was once held there, practical, spiritual, survival wisdom that helped people endure. But the echoes are faint and ambiguous, open to interpretation, mysterious, and maybe that is as it should be. Maybe some knowledge is meant to remain in the place and time where it was used, serving its purpose and then fading, leaving behind only traces for future generations to puzzle over and wonder about in the deep quiet of night. The wind carries voices from the past, but they are distorted by distance and time, impossible to hear with perfect clarity. We catch fragments of sentences, half-formed words, the emotional tone of something that mattered deeply to someone long gone. These fragments are precious precisely because they are incomplete, because they require us to engage our imagination, to fill the silences with possibilities rather than certainties. In the ruins of a collapsed cabin, we might find a peculiar arrangement of stones near what was once the hearth, stones that are not structural, that serve no obvious practical purpose, that someone placed with care and intention. Were they part of a folk ritual, a personal superstition, a remembered tradition from somewhere else entirely? We can speculate, but we cannot know. The stones remain, silent witnesses to an action whose meaning died with the person who performed it. And in that silence there is something profound, a recognition that not everything can or should be recovered, that the past maintains its dignity partly through its inaccessibility. The archaeological sites themselves are changing, slowly being reclaimed by the environment that the cabins once sheltered against. Permafrost shifts and heaves, disturbing foundations and scattering artifacts. Trees grow through collapsed roofs, their roots displacing timbers and mixing layers that archaeologists rely on to establish chronology. Animals burrow into ruins, creating new pathways that confuse the interpretation of original structures. Each year that passes, more evidence is lost, more questions become permanently unanswerable. There is an urgency to the work of studying these sites, a race against time's erasure. But there is also an acceptance that no matter how quickly or carefully we work, much will be lost. The frontier settlements are returning to the landscape, becoming part of the earth again, and while we can salvage some knowledge before that process completes, we cannot save everything. When researchers carefully excavate a site, they are also destroying it in a sense, disturbing the arrangement of materials, removing them from context, transforming a physical place into documented data. This is necessary for study, but it means that each excavation eliminates the possibility of future researchers approaching that same site with better techniques or different questions. We preserve through destruction, save through dismantling, and this paradox weighs on anyone who works with these fragile remnants of the past. The question of what we owe to the people who lived on this frontier is complex and not easily answered. Do we owe them accurate representation to the extent that our evidence allows? Certainly. Do we owe them respect for their struggles and achievements? Without question. But do we also owe them the space to remain partially unknown, to let some aspects of their lives rest in mystery rather than exposed to our analytical scrutiny? Perhaps so. There is a kind of violence in the archaeological gaze, however well-intentioned. We dig up what people buried, we examine what they left behind, we subject their choices to academic analysis. We do this in the service of knowledge to understand and honor how people lived, but we should also acknowledge that our investigation is an intrusion, a crossing of the boundary between past and present that cannot be entirely justified by our good intentions. The people who carved grooves into logs, who built curved chimneys, who dug trenches around their cabins, they did not do these things for us. did not expect that centuries later, strangers would puzzle over their work and debate its meaning. They did these things for themselves, for their families, for their immediate survival and well-being. That their actions have become subjects of historical inquiry is an accident of preservation, not a purpose they chose. We should approach their remnants with gratitude for what they reveal, but also with humility about our right to interpret them. The mysteries of the frontier also remind us about the limitations of different types of knowledge. Academic knowledge produced through systematic study and peer-reviewed publication is valuable and important, but it is not the only kind of knowledge, and it is not always superior to the experiential, embodied knowledge that frontier inhabitants possessed. A modern engineer might be able to calculate the optimal curve for a chimney to minimize backdraft using computational fluid dynamics and precise measurements. But the frontier builder who incorporated a curve based on observation, trial and error, and inherited wisdom might well have achieved equally effective results through entirely different means. Both types of knowledge are valid. Both produce real understanding. The frontier also generated knowledge that was never meant to be systematized or shared beyond small groups. A family might develop a particular ritual around sealing their cabin for winter, steps performed in a specific order with words spoken and actions taken that made sense within their private cosmology. This ritual knowledge served psychological and social functions. It created a sense of control in an uncontrollable environment. It bound family members together through shared practice. It marked the transition from one season to another with appropriate gravity. Whether the ritual had any practical effect on the cabin's wind resistance was almost beside the point. Its value lay in what it did for the people performing it. When we find evidence of such practices in the archaeological record, we often struggle to interpret them because we are looking for practical function when the function might have been primarily emotional or spiritual. A feature that seems inexplicable from an engineering standpoint might make perfect sense from a psychological or cultural one, but without access to the interior lives of the builders, we cannot always make these distinctions. The passage of time has made the frontier inhabitants into characters in a story we tell about human adaptation and survival. But they were not characters, they were people, as complex and contradictory as we are. They had fears that kept them awake at night, hopes that sustained them through hardship, relationships that gave their lives meaning beyond mere survival. They laughed at jokes we will never hear, sang songs we will never recover, told stories that have vanished completely. The structures they built were just one small part of their existence, and even our most thorough archaeological investigation can only partially reconstruct what their lives were really like. We must remember that the fragments we study were embedded in a larger context of daily experience that is now irrecoverable. When we talk about how settlers adapted to Siberian winds, we are describing one aspect of a much more complicated reality. Yes, they built cabins with various wind resistance features, but they also fell in love, raised children, quarreled with neighbors, told lies and truths, felt boredom and excitement, experienced beauty and ugliness. They were not reducible to their survival strategies, even though those strategies are what we can most easily trace in the physical record. A researcher examining a grooved log is looking at a piece of wood modified by human hands, but a more complete perspective would acknowledge that those hands belonged to a person with a name, a history, a personality, people they cared about, dreams for the future that may or may not have been realized. The groove is not just an archaeological feature, it is a tiny monument to human presence, a mark that says, I was here, I worked, I tried to make things better. Every artifact we study carries this weight of human existence, and we honor the past most fully when we remember the people behind the objects. The Siberian frontier was a place of hardship, certainly, but it was also a place of human persistence, and occasionally even joy. People did not simply endure, they built communities, created traditions, found moments of pleasure and satisfaction, A winter evening in a well-sealed cabin with family gathered around the hearth might have been harsh by our standards, but could still offer warmth, connection, and contentment. The absence of modern comforts did not preclude happiness. People have always found ways to create meaning and satisfaction within whatever circumstances they inhabit. The mysteries we puzzle over today were simply daily life for the people who lived on the frontier. They did not see their construction techniques as mysterious. They knew exactly why they did what they did, even if that knowledge was based more on tradition and intuition than on scientific understanding. The mystery is ours, a product of temporal distance and lost context. What seems enigmatic to us was ordinary to them, and what they might have found most interesting about their lives, the social dramas, the personal stories, the emotional textures of daily experience, is mostly invisible to us now. As the night deepens and our contemplation of these mysteries continues, we return again and again to the fundamental limitation. We cannot ask the people who were there. We cannot sit down with an 18th century frontier settler and say, "Why did you carve these grooves? What were you trying to accomplish? What did you believe about wind and spirits and protection?" The conversation we wish we could have is impossible, separated from us by an unbridgeable gulf of time. And so we do what historians have always done. We gather what evidence remains, we apply our analytical tools, we construct interpretations that seem plausible, and we acknowledge the vast uncertainty that surrounds our conclusions. The wind that blows across the Siberian frontier today is the same wind that challenged those early settlers, but it blows through a transformed landscape. Where cabins once stood, there is often only wilderness now. The settlements that seemed permanent to the people who built them proved temporary on historical scales. Trees have grown where fields once were cleared. Rivers have changed their courses. The permafrost shifts and settles, erasing the traces of human habitation with patient geological indifference. In another few centuries, even the ruins we now study may be completely gone, absorbed back into the earth, leaving no evidence that people ever struggled here. And yet the struggle mattered, at least to those who lived it. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the meaning of those lives does not depend on whether future generations remember them or understand their choices. They lived, they built, they persevered, they passed their knowledge to their children until the line of transmission broke. Their existence had value in itself, not because of what they left for us, but because of what they experienced in their own time. We study them not to justify their lives, which need no justification, but to connect across time, to recognize our common humanity with people who face challenges we can barely imagine. The mysteries that remain, the questions we cannot answer, are simply honest acknowledgements of the limits of historical knowledge, and in acknowledging those limits we show respect for the past by refusing to pretend we know more than we do. The frontier settlers built their cabins against the wind, and in those structures they embedded knowledge, belief, hope, and fear. Some of that has survived for us to examine. Much has been lost forever. What we have is precious and fragmentary, like shards of pottery that hint at the vessel's original shape without fully revealing it. We piece together what we can, we speculate carefully about the rest, and we accept that the full picture will never come into focus. The wind continues its eternal motion, indifferent to human habitation, and in that indifference there is a kind of truth. The settlers did not tame the wind. They found ways to live with it, to survive despite its force. They built their temporary shelters in a landscape that would outlast them by millennia. And now we, temporary in our own turn, look back at their temporary solutions and find them mysterious, beautiful, and ultimately incomplete. The night grows later, and the mysteries remain. In the silence, we can almost hear the wind of centuries past, carrying voices we cannot quite discern, telling stories we cannot quite hear. And in that almost hearing, that sense of being close to understanding but never quite reaching it, we find perhaps the most honest relationship we can have with a past that exists now, only in fragments and whispers. As our journey through these frozen memories continues, let us shift our attention to a different kind of experience, one lived behind thicker walls and warmer fires. Not all who faced the Siberian winter winds did so with the same resources or the same fears. There existed, even on the frontier, a hierarchy of shelter and security. Governors appointed by distant authorities, wealthy merchants who had profited from trade, military officers stationed in administrative centers. These people inhabited a different winter than the common settlers whose lives we have been tracing. The homes of the elite were constructed with advantages that most frontier families could barely imagine. Where a settler's cabin used whatever timber could be cut and hauled by a single family's labor, elite residences employed hired craftsmen who could select the finest logs from the best forests. These craftsmen, new techniques learned in established cities, brought with them standards of construction that reflected generations of refined practice. The walls of elite homes were often double-layered, with logs both inside and out, and an air gap between them filled with insulating material. This double construction required far more timber and far more labor, but it created a barrier against wind and cold that was significantly more effective than any single wall cabin could achieve. The gaps between logs were chinked, not just with moss and clay, but with carefully prepared mixtures that might include lime, hair, and other binding agents that created more durable seals. The windows of elite homes were fitted with actual glass, imported at considerable expense from distant manufactories. Glass was a luxury that transformed the experience of winter indoors. It allowed light to enter while keeping wind completely out, something that hide-covered openings could never fully achieve. Heavy wooden shutters could be closed over the glass when storms were most severe, providing additional protection. These shutters were mounted on iron hinges that did not warp or break, like the leather hinges common in settler cabins. The doors were constructed of thick planks, often reinforced with iron straps, and fitted into frames built with precision that minimized gaps. The chimneys of elite homes were another mark of privilege. While settlers struggled with chimneys built from fieldstone and clay, often crude and prone to cracking, elite homes featured chimneys constructed of brick. Brick was expensive, it had to be made, which required clay deposits, fuel for firing, and skilled labor, or imported, which added transportation costs. But brick chimneys were far superior in performance. They drew more consistently, they withstood heat without cracking, and they could be designed with internal baffles and curves that managed smoke and prevented downdrafts more effectively than stone chimneys ever could. The hearths in elite homes were larger, capable of holding bigger fires that produced more heat. The floors of elite residences were often planked wood rather than packed earth, creating another barrier against cold rising from the ground. Some particularly wealthy homes had raised wooden floors with a crawl space beneath, providing an additional layer of insulation. Walls might be covered with fabric or decorated with painted panels, both of which added modest insulating value, but more importantly, transformed the psychological experience of the space. A decorated interior felt warmer somehow, more civilized, farther removed from the raw cold outside. The wealthy could afford to burn more fuel. Their storehouses held larger reserves of firewood, sometimes supplemented with coal imported at great expense. While settler families carefully rationed each log, counting what remained and worrying whether supplies would last until spring, elite households could keep fires burning higher and longer. The difference in temperature might only be a few degrees, but those degrees mattered immensely for comfort and health. Children in wealthy homes were less likely to suffer from constant cold exposure. Adults could work at desks or tables without their hands going numb. Sleep was less interrupted by shivering and the need to tend fires. The positioning of elite homes also reflected privilege. Wealthy residents could choose the most favorable building sites, locations where natural features of the landscape provided windbreaks. A hillside that blocked north winds, a stand of mature forest that disrupted the wind's path, a slight valley that offered protection. These desirable locations went to those with power and resources. Settlers took what remained, often exposed locations, where wind struck with full force. The wealthy built their homes in clusters that might be called neighborhoods, structures positioned close enough together that they provided mutual wind protection. The spaces between elite homes were often enclosed with high fences or walls, creating courtyards that were sheltered from wind. These courtyards became social spaces during winter months, places where children could play and adults could move between buildings without facing the full blast of open-air wind. Settler cabins, scattered more widely across the landscape, lacked these communal windbreaks. Inside elite homes, winter evenings unfolded differently than in settler cabins. With better light from multiple candles or oil lamps, another expense most settlers could not afford, wealthy families could engage in activities that required good illumination. Reading was possible not just by the fitful light of the hearth, but by steady lamplight. Writing letters, keeping account books, studying maps, these were evening occupations of the educated and prosperous. Music was sometimes played, instruments that would be damaged by the temperature extremes in poorly heated cabins could survive in well-maintained, elite homes. The wind outside was still audible, still present, but it became more like theatrical backdrop than immediate threat. Wealthy families gathered in the evening, not huddled around the hearth for survival, but seated in chairs around tables, their comfort assured. Conversations could be held at normal volume rather than shouted over the wind's roar. The constant sensory assault of cold drafts, smoke, and the creaking of stressed timbers was greatly reduced. Winter for the elite retained an element of inconvenience and confinement, but it lacked the existential dread that characterized the settler experience. When storms arrived, wealthy families prepared differently. Their servants, for elite households often employed servants, would be dispatched to ensure that shutters were secured, that additional firewood was brought inside, that the kitchen was stocked with provisions. The family itself might need to do little more than retreat to the most sheltered rooms and wait for the storm to pass. If damage occurred, craftsmen could be hired for repairs. If supplies ran low, wealth could purchase what was available, often at inflated prices that desperate sellers could charge when winter isolated communities from normal trade routes. Wealth did not make one immune to winter, but it provided buffers that transformed the experience. Yet privilege on the frontier was relative, and even the wealthy faced limitations and fears that would be unfamiliar to their counterparts in established cities. Glass windows, while far superior to hide coverings, could still shatter in extreme conditions. Ice storms, freezing rain that coated everything in thick layers of ice, could break even the best windows, leaving elite homes suddenly exposed to wind and cold. When this happened, the damage was not just to property but to the psychological comfort of security. A broken window in the middle of winter, with replacement glass hundreds of kilometers away, was a serious crisis. Temporary repairs using boards or hide were humiliating for those who prided themselves on their superior accommodations. Brick chimneys, though more reliable than stone, could still fail. Ice could form inside the flue during extreme cold, blocking the passage and causing smoke to back up into the house. The weight of accumulated snow on roofs could exceed the capacity even of well-built structures, causing beams to crack and sections to collapse. When elite homes suffered catastrophic failures, the shock was perhaps greater than for settlers who lived with constant precariousness. The wealthy expected their privilege to protect them, and when it did not, the failure felt particularly unjust. Supply chains that the elite depended upon were vulnerable to weather in ways that highlighted the fragility of their advantages. A wealthy family might plan to host a formal dinner, expecting imported delicacies, fine tea, preserved fruits, quality spirits, only to find that the caravan bringing such goods had been delayed or destroyed by storms. Suddenly their abundance looked much like everyone else's scarcity. The servants they employed to manage their households might be unable to reach work during the worst weather, forcing elite family members to perform tasks they considered beneath their station, hauling firewood, tending stoves, even basic cleaning. These moments revealed how much of their comfort depended on others' labor, and how quickly that comfort could evaporate when circumstances changed. Social hierarchies persisted through winter, but were sometimes complicated by the demands of survival. When a major storm threatened an entire settlement, wealthy residents might open their superior homes to neighbors whose cabins were failing. This was partly charity, but also pragmatism. A settlement where many people died weakened everyone, reducing available labor, trade, and community resilience. An elite family hosting a settler family in their guest room during a 3-day blizzard experienced a strange intimacy. Social boundaries blurred when people shared confined space and genuine danger. These temporary equalizations often ended as soon as the crisis passed, with hierarchies reasserting themselves, but they left traces in the community's memory. People remembered who had offered shelter and who had not. The maintenance of elite homes required constant attention, though this attention was often performed by paid labor rather than the homeowner's hands. Servants monitored gaps in chinking, cleared snow from roofs, kept multiple fires burning in different rooms. But the fundamental battle was the same as for settlers. Wind constantly sought entry, cold constantly tried to steal warmth, structures constantly needed repair. The elite simply had more resources to throw at the problem, which changed the experience but not the underlying reality. A governor, living in the finest house in a frontier town, still woke some mornings to frost on the inside of his windows, still heard wind howling around his walls, still felt drafts that his expensive construction could not entirely eliminate. Wealth brought degrees of comfort, not absolute immunity. The social calendar of elite communities was profoundly shaped by winter's constraints. In warmer months, there might be outdoor gatherings, hunting parties, excursions to scenic locations. Winter contracted social life dramatically. The elite visited each other's homes when possible, turning these visits into elaborate social rituals that helped pass the long, dark months. But such visits required either very short distances, neighbors close enough to reach without serious exposure, or careful planning and favorable weather. A dinner invitation might be extended weeks in advance, with the understanding that actual attendance depended on whether the wind died down and snow conditions allowed travel. Cancelled plans were common, and the disappointment of isolation affected the wealthy as much as anyone. Humans are social creatures, and even those with comfortable homes and adequate supplies suffered from the loneliness of being cut off from their peers for weeks at a time. The psychological strain of confinement, seeing only one's immediate family and household servants, unable to escape into wider social networks, created tensions that sometimes erupted into conflict. Families that got along well enough when they could retreat to separate pursuits found themselves on edge when forced into constant proximity. Marital disputes, conflicts between parents and children, tensions with servants, all of these were exacerbated by the inability to find space and distance. Elite families were not immune to the cabin fever that affected everyone trapped indoors by winter winds. The children of elite families had different winter experiences than settler children, yet still faced limitations and fears. They had warmer clothes, better nutrition, safer homes. They were less likely to suffer from frostbite or malnutrition, or the constant low-grade cold that weakened settler children's health. But they still knew fear when storms rose, still heard the wind's menacing voice, still understood on some level that outside was deadly. Elite children were often educated indoors during winter months by tutors or literate family members, and the quality of this education depended heavily on keeping the study space warm enough that ink did not freeze and fingers remained nimble enough to hold pens. Even privilege could not fully escape winter's constraints. Sometimes the contrast between elite and settler experiences was most visible in the aftermath of major storms. When dawn came after a catastrophic night of wind, elite families might emerge from homes that were damaged but intact, facing repairs that were significant but manageable. Settler families might emerge to find their homes destroyed, their survival dependent on community charity, and their ability to rebuild from almost nothing. The differential impact of the same storm highlighted inequality in stark terms, yet the wealthy understood, at least dimly, that their privilege was somewhat fragile on the frontier. In established cities far from the frontier, class distinctions were more rigid, hierarchies more stable. On the frontier, fortune could shift more rapidly. A wealthy merchant could lose everything if a trading venture failed. A governor could be recalled or replaced, losing position and privilege. The wilderness pressed in on everyone, and while wealth provided cushioning, it did not guarantee permanent security. This awareness sometimes created a degree of humility, a recognition that being wealthy on the frontier was different from being wealthy in safe, established places. Some elite residents developed genuine respect for the hardiness of settlers who survived with so much less. Others remained dismissive or oblivious, insulated by their advantages from understanding what life was truly like for those with fewer resources. Human nature varied then as now. One interesting aspect of elite winter life was the way some wealthy individuals became patrons of knowledge about winter survival. A prosperous merchant might fund the construction of a communal storm shelter, not just from altruism, but because a surviving community was good for business. A governor might order the compilation of best practices for winter building, distributing this information to new settlers as a way of reducing winter mortality rates. Elite residents with time and education sometimes documented frontier knowledge that would otherwise remain purely oral. These documents, journals, letters, official reports, now provide historians with valuable insights into frontier life, though they come filtered through the perspective of privilege. An elite observer writing about how settlers weathered winter might miss or misunderstand aspects that a settler would consider obvious, while noticing things that settlers took for granted. The architectural legacy of elite construction on the frontier outlasted most settler cabins. Built with better materials and maintained by more resources, elite homes had higher survival rates through the centuries. When archaeologists excavate frontier settlements, the most intact structures are usually those built for the wealthy. This creates a skewed archaeological record. We have better physical evidence of how the elite lived than how common settlers lived. The irony is that the elite, being a small minority, represent the unusual rather than the typical frontier experience. Their homes tell us about the possibilities of frontier building when resources were abundant, but most people lived without such resources. Reconstructing the more common experience requires looking at fragmentary remains of simpler structures and reading between the lines of elite documents that mention the poor primarily as objects of concern or labor. There were also interesting cases of fallen elite families who arrived with wealth but lost it due to bad fortune, poor decisions, or catastrophic losses. These families sometimes ended up living in conditions closer to common settlers, a descent that was psychologically devastating. A family that had lived with glazed windows and brick chimneys, now making do with hide coverings and stone hearths, experienced winter not just with physical discomfort, but with the bitter taste of lost status. Their children, who remembered warmer houses, had to adapt to harsher conditions. Such families sometimes became bridges between social classes, possessing elite knowledge and perspectives but living settler realities. Their adaptation strategies, how they coped with reduced circumstances, what skills they developed, what knowledge they retained or discarded, offer insights into the relationship between material resources and survival competence. As we consider these contrasts between elite and common experiences, a larger truth emerges about winter winds on the frontier. The wind itself was indifferent to human hierarchies. It blew with equal force against mansions and cabins, seeking entry wherever structure met space. What differed was human capacity to resist: thicker walls, better materials, more labor, superior knowledge. Privilege brought resistance but not immunity. The most secure elite home was still a fragile bubble of warmth in a vast, cold landscape. The least secure settler cabin still represented human ingenuity and determination. Between these extremes lay a spectrum of experiences, all shaped by the same fundamental challenge of surviving winter winds. There is something almost philosophical in contemplating this range of experiences, how the same environmental force pressed upon different lives with similar relentlessness but met different barriers, created different outcomes. A wealthy child sleeping warm under imported blankets in a well-heated room, and a settler child huddled under pieced-together furs in a drafty cabin, were both living through the same winter, under the same sky, surrounded by the same howling wind. Their experiences were profoundly different in comfort and security, yet fundamentally similar in being human responses to deadly cold. Both families worried when the wind rose to a shriek. Both felt relief when storms passed without catastrophic damage. Both knew the deep satisfaction of making it through another winter, of seeing the first signs of spring thaw. The elite had easier winters, but they were still winter. The fear was different in degree, but not entirely in kind. A wealthy family losing their home to storm was rare but possible, and the knowledge that disaster could strike, however buffered by resources, created its own form of anxiety. Settlers lived with constant precariousness, but they also lived with a kind of fatalistic acceptance, a knowledge that they had done what they could, and that survival often came down to luck as much as preparation. As dawn approaches and our journey through these memories of winter winds begins to draw toward its close, let us hold in our minds this complex picture of frontier winter life. Not a single story, but many stories, lived at different levels of comfort and security, but all pressed upon by the same cold winds. The architecture of privilege and the architecture of necessity existed side by side, sometimes learning from each other, always defined by their relationship to the environment they inhabited. The wind blew through it all, democratic in its pressure, even if human responses were stratified by wealth and power. And when spring finally came, as it always eventually did, both elite and settler emerged from their respective shelters into a world transformed by warmth, grateful to have survived another season of deadly winds. The stratification of comfort would persist through other seasons, but winter's end was celebrated across all social boundaries, a shared relief that made the human community briefly more visible than the hierarchies within it. The wind's voice faded to breezes and life continued, as it had and would for as long as people chose to make their homes in that cold land. And so we arrive at the end of our slow journey through the frozen world of early frontier settlements, where winter winds shaped every aspect of existence. We have walked through the daily struggles of common settlers, followed the life of one man who learned to read the wind, explored the mysteries embedded in old construction techniques, and witnessed how privilege altered but did not eliminate the challenge of surviving winter. What remains when we look back across all these fragments of history is a picture of human persistence, of the countless small adaptations that allowed life to continue in conditions that seem almost unimaginable to us now. The people who lived through those winters, whether in rough cabins or relatively comfortable elite homes, endured something we are largely spared. We who live in climate-controlled homes behind insulated walls and double-paned windows, with central heating that responds to a thermostat's touch, have been freed from the constant battle against cold and wind that defined frontier winter life. Our ancestors fought that battle so persistently that we inherited a world where such struggles became increasingly rare. When we feel a draft in our modern homes, we consider it an annoyance worth fixing, not an accepted feature of daily life. When the heating falters, we call professionals to repair it, not spend desperate hours trying to coax warmth from inadequate fires. The transformation across a few generations has been profound. We sleep through winter nights without waking to tend fires or check for roof damage. Children grow up never knowing the constant cold that their distant ancestors accepted as normal. This is not to say we face no challenges. Every era has its own difficulties, but the specific challenge of keeping deadly wind at bay has been largely solved for most of us. Yet there is value in remembering what was endured. Those frontier settlers, packing moss between logs with frozen fingers, rebuilding after storms, sharing knowledge that helped families survive. They were not special or heroic in their own minds. They were simply doing what had to be done to continue living. Their ordinariness is part of what makes their efforts remarkable. They did not expect monuments or recognition. They expected to wake each morning, assess the damage from the night, make repairs, and continue. The rhythm of their days was defined by necessity, and they met that necessity with practical determination. Semyon Grigorievich, the wind reader whose story we followed, represents something important about human adaptation. He was shaped by childhood trauma, the loss of his family's home, into someone who made it his life's work to understand and resist the forces that had caused that loss. His knowledge was hard-won, built from careful observation over decades. His legacy was not fame or wealth, but the continued survival of people who benefited from his insights. This kind of quiet competence, expertise developed through patient attention and shared without expectation of reward, is perhaps one of the most valuable human qualities. It appears throughout history in countless forms, most of it undocumented, most of the practitioners unknown to us. But the effects persist. Knowledge passed down, techniques refined, communities made more resilient. The mysteries we explored, the grooved logs, the curved chimneys, the unexplained trenches, remind us that much of human experience escapes documentation. People solved problems in ways that made sense to them, in their context, with their available resources and cultural frameworks. When enough time passes and contexts change, those solutions can become puzzling to later observers. We do our best to interpret the fragments that remain, but honest interpretation acknowledges its own limitations. The past is not a book we can simply read. It is a damaged text with missing pages, written in languages we only partly understand, describing experiences foreign to our own. We reconstruct what we can, honor what we cannot fully know, and remain humble about the limits of our understanding. The contrast between elite and settler experiences highlights how resource inequality shapes lived reality. Both groups faced winter winds, but with vastly different means of resistance. This pattern, the privileged being able to buy greater comfort and security, is not unique to frontier Siberia or to winter survival. It appears across human societies in countless forms. What makes the frontier case particularly stark is how directly the inequality translated into physical comfort and survival chances. There was little room for abstraction or rationalization. Thicker walls meant more warmth, full stop. Better supplies meant less hunger, directly and obviously. The naked clarity of these relationships perhaps made inequality harder to ignore, though human capacity for accepting or justifying social hierarchies should never be underestimated. As we sit here in the deep quiet of night, or the early stillness of morning, or wherever this story finds you in your own daily rhythm, we can reflect on what we have inherited from those who struggled against winter winds. We inherited structures, not just physical buildings, though some frontier architecture persists in museums and historical sites, but knowledge structures, problem-solving approaches, traditions of mutual aid and community resilience that were forged in harsh conditions. We inherited a certain toughness, perhaps a genetic and cultural legacy of people who survived when survival was genuinely difficult. We inherited technologies and techniques that evolved from simpler origins. Modern insulation has its distant ancestors in moss packing, modern weather stripping in hide strips wedged around doors. We inherited stories, though many have been lost or transformed in the telling, stories that remind us what humans can endure and overcome. But perhaps most importantly, we inherited a world where fewer people must endure what those frontier settlers endured. Each generation that improved building techniques, that developed better materials, that shared knowledge more widely, that created systems of support and safety, each generation reduced the number of people who faced deadly winter winds from fragile shelters. This is a form of progress worth acknowledging, even as we recognize that progress is uneven and that many people worldwide still face conditions of precariousness that the settlers would recognize. History is not a simple story of improvement, but neither is it meaningless suffering. The struggles mattered because they led to changes, to learned lessons, to increments of betterment that accumulated over time. As you prepare to drift towards sleep, or as you move into your day, carry with you perhaps this thought. The walls around you, whatever they are made of, stand between you and forces that were once immediate and deadly. Someone figured out how to build those walls, or walls like them. Someone passed that knowledge forward. Someone labored to construct them. The shelter you inhabit is the heir to countless earlier shelters, each one teaching lessons that informed the next. The warmth you feel is warmth that earlier generations struggled to create and maintain. You are the beneficiary of accumulated human ingenuity applied to the basic problem of staying warm and alive. This is not meant to induce guilt for your comfort. You did not choose to be born into this time rather than that one. But perhaps it can inspire a quiet gratitude, an acknowledgement that comfort is not natural or guaranteed, but rather built, maintained, and passed forward through human effort. When the wind rises outside your window tonight, and you hear it pressing against the glass, you might think for a moment about settlers who heard similar wind but faced it with so much less. And then you might sink deeper into your blankets, grateful for the technology and knowledge and accumulated wisdom that stands between you and the cold. Let yourself drift now into whatever rest awaits you. The wind blows still somewhere over landscapes where people once struggled against it with moss and clay and determination. But here, now, you are safe. The walls are strong, the heat is reliable, the night is merely peaceful darkness rather than threatening cold. The stories we have traced tonight of daily hardship, of one man's life shaped by wind, of mysteries embedded in old structures, of privilege and poverty both pressed by the same cold forces, these stories have done their work. They have filled the quiet hours with gentle fascination, with history's slow rhythms, with the calm contemplation of lives lived long ago. As you close your eyes, let those frozen landscapes fade into softer visions, dreams less troubled than the reality those settlers knew. You have traveled with me through winter's harsh grip on the early frontier, and now you can return to your own comfort, your own warmth, your own safe shelter. The wind that once threatened survival now becomes merely a sound, distant and neutralized, perhaps even soothing in its remoteness. Sleep well, knowing that the long battle against winter winds has been largely won, that you are heir to that victory, that the warmth around you represents humanity's patient triumph over one of nature's oldest challenges. The deadly winds still blow across Siberian plains, across any cold landscape, but they blow past structures built with the knowledge those early settlers helped develop. They blow themselves out against walls that remember, in their design, if not their materials, the lessons learned log by log, storm by storm, generation by generation. And here, in this moment, you need only rest, comfortable and warm, while history's hard-won wisdom keeps you safe through the quiet hours. Good night, traveler through time. Good rest to you wherever you are, whatever hour you find yourself in. May your sleep be deep and your dreams be gentle, free from the howling winds that once threatened, but now only whisper in memory, growing fainter as you drift away into peaceful darkness, into warm and restful sleep, into the quiet that follows all stories when they finally, softly, come to their end.